What if the gods that walked among the Sumerians weren't benevolent creators, but something the people needed protection from? What if beneath the great ziggurats and temple complexes of ancient Mesopotamia there existed another world, carved into darkness, where ordinary people sought refuge from beings they called the Anunnaki, in the ruins of southern Iraq, where archaeologists have spent more than a century uncovering the foundations of civilization itself? Certain discoveries resist simple explanation. Tunnels beneath temples, chambers sealed with unusual care, storage rooms that seem too large, too deep, too deliberately hidden for mere grain or treasure. So before the story pulls you under, take a moment to like this video and hit subscribe, but only if you're drawn to histories that blur the line between divine visitation and human survival. And if you're still here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this ancient question stretching across the world, connecting us all in the dark. The Anunnaki were real to the Sumerians. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, real. Their names appear on thousands of clay tablets. Their presence shapes every aspect of Sumerian cosmology, law, and daily life. But what if the relationship between gods and humans wasn't what we've been taught? What if the archaeological evidence beneath the great temple complexes suggests something more complicated than worship? Tonight, we descend beneath the birthplace of writing itself, following passages that lead into darkness, searching for answers the ancient Sumerians may have literally buried. The Anunnaki appear in the earliest Sumerian texts not as distant, abstract deities, but as physical beings who came down from the sky and walked among humans with tangible presence and specific needs. When archaeologists first translated the creation myths preserved on tablets from Nippur and Ur, they found descriptions that resisted easy categorization as purely symbolic. These weren't vague spiritual forces. The texts named them individually, described their hierarchies, recorded their decisions about humanity with the bureaucratic precision that characterized everything Sumerian. Anu, the Sky Father; Enlil, who commanded the winds; Enki, who shaped humans from clay in the Abzu, the watery deep beneath the earth. But it was their relationship with humanity that archaeologists found most striking. A relationship the texts describe with unsettling specificity as one of labour, service, and occasionally fear. The word Anunnaki itself carries meaning that scholars have debated for more than a century. In Sumerian, it roughly translates to quote zero or quote one not metaphorical heaven, not spiritual realm. The Sumerian word for heaven, quote 2, referred to the physical sky above, the same sky where they tracked Venus and Mars with mathematical precision. When the texts say the Anunnaki descended from _quote_3_, they mean it with the same literal directness they used to record grain stores and land boundaries. These beings came from above, from the sky, and that arrival marks something fundamental in how the Sumerians understood their own existence. Consider the tone of these texts. Sumerian scribes were meticulous bureaucrats, trained in the Aduba schools to record transactions, legal codes, astronomical observations, and administrative details with clinical accuracy. They didn't write in the flowery metaphors that would later characterize Greek mythology or biblical allegory. When a Sumerian text says Enlil divided the earth, assigned domains to lesser gods, and created kingship to organize human labor, it reads like minutes from a meeting. When it says the Anunnaki Council gathered to decide humanity's fate, it names who attended, who spoke, and what they decided with the same matter-of-fact precision used to record temple offerings. Samuel Noah Kramer, the renowned Sumerologist who dedicated his life to translating these ancient texts, noted this peculiar quality in his 1956 work, quote, "For the Sumerians," he observed, treated their gods not as mysterious, unknowable forces, but as powerful individuals with distinct personalities, specific responsibilities, and recognizable behaviors. Anu ruled from heaven but rarely interfered directly. Enlil commanded the atmosphere, controlled storms, and made most of the decisions affecting humanity. Enki, cleverer and more sympathetic to humans, often worked around Enlil's harsher decrees. These weren't archetypes or symbols. They were to the Sumerians real beings with real authority over human affairs. But what makes the relationship between Anunnaki and humans particularly striking in these texts is its transactional nature. The creation of humanity wasn't an act of love or spiritual fulfillment. According to the Atrahasis epic and the Enuma Elish, humans were created to perform labour that the lesser gods, the Igigi, had rebelled against doing. The texts are explicit about this. The Anunnaki needed workers. Enki shaped humans from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god, specifically to create beings capable of maintaining the earth, tending the fields, building the temples, and providing offerings that the Anunnaki required. Humanity's purpose in the Sumerian understanding was service. This relationship explains much about Sumerian religious practice. The massive temple complexes weren't primarily for human worship, but for housing and feeding the gods who dwelt there. Each temple maintained a staff of priests, singers, and servants, whose job was to provide daily meals, clothing, and care for the god's statue and dwelling. The texts describe these offerings not as symbolic gestures, but as actual sustenance the gods required. Hymns to Enlil at Nippur detail the precise meals served to the god each day, the quality of bread and beer, the cuts of meat, as if he actually ate them, as if the Anunnaki had physical needs that humans were obligated to meet. And when humans failed to meet these needs, or when their numbers grew too large, or when their noise became unbearable to divine ears, the texts describe consequences that sound less like divine judgment and more like population control. Plague sent deliberately, drought imposed as policy, and ultimately the flood decided upon in council, with only Enki dissenting and secretly warning one man to survive. The Anunnaki appear in these texts not as loving creators mourning the necessity of human suffering, but as administrators solving a problem through the most efficient means available. The archaeological evidence doesn't contradict these textual descriptions. The great temples at Nippur, Eridu, and Uruk weren't designed for congregational worship. They were houses, literally called, quote, 5 houses of the gods. Massive complexes with kitchens, storage rooms, bedrooms, and courtyards sized for a staff serving resident deities. The ziggurats that dominated the skyline weren't monuments to human aspiration, but stairways providing the Anunnaki access between heaven and earth. Landing platforms connecting the sky they came from to the earth where humans laboured. But if the Anunnaki were real to the Sumerians, if these beings actually walked among them with physical presence and specific demands, then other aspects of Sumerian architecture start to make uncomfortable sense. The tunnels beneath the temples, the underground chambers, the spaces carved deep into the earth with such deliberate care. Perhaps worship wasn't the only relationship humans had with the gods who descended from heaven. Perhaps there was also fear and the practical need sometimes to hide. In 1899, when German archaeologists began excavating the ancient Sumerian city of Uruk, they expected temples, palaces, and the usual architecture of early civilization. What they found beneath the great temple complex of Iana stopped them cold. Tunnels. Not simple drainage or sewage channels, but deliberately constructed passages leading deep beneath the sacred precinct, their walls finished with the same careful brickwork as the temples above. Robert Koldewey, who would later excavate Babylon, stood in those passages with a lamp trying to understand their purpose. The tunnels extended far beyond any practical need. They connected to chambers that showed no evidence of storage, no remains of treasure or grain. Just empty rooms deep beneath the earth, sealed at some point in antiquity with such thoroughness that sand and silence had preserved them for 5,000 years. Koldewey's initial reports, preserved in the archives of the German Oriental Society, describe his confusion. He was excavating what should have been the most sacred complex in Uruk, the temple dedicated to Inanna, goddess of love and war, and to Anu, the Sky Father himself. The temple above ground showed the expected features: massive walls, elaborate decoration, evidence of ritual activity spanning centuries. But beneath it, these passages led nowhere obvious. They didn't connect to the city's water supply. They didn't align with burial practices. They simply descended, level after level, into carefully constructed chambers whose walls bore the marks of professional bricklayers, working with the same skill evident in the grandest above-ground structures. The brickwork itself told a story. These weren't crude tunnels dug hastily for emergency shelter. Every wall showed evidence of careful planning, precise measurements, and skilled execution. The vaults that roofed the deeper chambers demonstrated knowledge of engineering that rivaled anything in the temple complex above. Whoever built these spaces intended them to last, to bear weight, to remain stable even with the enormous pressure of earth and architecture pressing down from above. This was permanent construction, built with the same reverence and skill the Sumerians applied to their most important buildings. But built for what? Koldewey documented the tunnels, mapped their extent, and noted their peculiarities in his field notes. Then, like most archaeologists of his era, he moved on to more understandable finds. The tunnels were noted, catalogued, and largely forgotten in favour of the tablets, statues, and artefacts that told clearer stories about Sumerian civilization. It would take decades before other archaeologists, excavating other Sumerian sites, would find similar underground construction and begin to ask whether this was pattern rather than anomaly. At Leonard Woolley found them in the 1920s. At Nippur, American archaeologists documented them in the 1950s. At Eridu, the oldest city in Sumer, British teams found the most extensive underground complex of all, descending in levels toward the water table beneath the Temple of Enki. Each excavation team noted these subterranean spaces, puzzled over them, offered explanations about storage or ritual purity, and ultimately catalogued them as unusual architectural features of unknown purpose. Because the alternative explanation, that these were deliberately constructed refuges, that the people who invented writing and mathematics and law had felt the need to create spaces beneath the earth where they could hide, seemed to contradict everything archaeology thought it understood about early civilization. Yet the spaces remained, silent testimony to Sumerian priorities that modern scholars struggle to interpret: empty chambers, sealed passages, architecture that spoke of protection, of withdrawal, of creating a world beneath the world where something, or someone, could take shelter from whatever moved above. To the Sumerians, the cosmos consisted of three realms: heaven where the Anunnaki originated, the earth where humans struggled, and the Abzu, the primordial waters beneath the world where Enki established his dwelling. But recent archaeological work suggests the Abzu may have been more than mythological. Excavations beneath the Temple of Enki at Eridu, the oldest city in Sumer, revealed something unexpected: a complex system of underground chambers built around a freshwater spring, descending in levels deep into the earth. The architecture suggests these weren't simply wells or water management systems. The chambers were large enough for gatherings. The walls bore traces of ritual activity, and the deepest levels, those closest to the water source, showed evidence of permanent occupation, as if people had lived there, beneath the earth, for extended periods. Eridu holds a special place in Sumerian mythology and archaeology both. The Sumerian king list, that remarkable document that traces kingship back through impossible spans of time to when _quote_6_ names Eridu as the first city, the place where civilization itself began. The texts say Enki built his house there, in the Abzu, the freshwater deep beneath the earth. For centuries, scholars assumed the Abzu was purely mythological, a cosmic ocean that existed in religious imagination but had no physical correlate. Then they excavated Eridu and found that Enki's temple stood directly above a powerful freshwater spring that still flows today, 4,000 years after the city was abandoned. The spring itself isn't unusual. groundwater exists throughout Mesopotamia. But what the Sumerians built around this spring defies simple explanation. The earliest temple structure at Eridu, dating to around 5500 BCE, was a small building, barely more than a room with an altar. But over the next 2,000 years, the Sumerians rebuilt this temple 18 times, each structure larger and more elaborate than the last, creating a massive artificial mound that eventually rose more than 40 feet above the surrounding plain. Above ground, the temples grew grander. Below ground, they dug deeper. British archaeologist Seton Lloyd, who excavated Eridu in the 1940s and 50s, documented a series of chambers and passages descending beneath the temple platform toward the spring below. The construction astonished him. These weren't crude caves or simple wells. They were carefully engineered spaces, their walls lined with brick, their ceilings vaulted to bear enormous weight. The deepest chambers reached the water table, where the spring emerged from the earth, cold and fresh in a land of scorching summers and brackish rivers. Lloyd's excavation notes describe finding traces of burning in these deep chambers, suggesting lamps or fires that had illuminated the darkness. Pottery shards, tool marks on the walls, evidence that people had spent time here, had worked here, had perhaps lived here in the watery deep beneath Enki's house. The Sumerian texts say the Abzu was Enki's domain, the place from which he governed the fresh waters that made civilization possible. Hymns describe him dwelling there, surrounded by abundance, controlling the springs and rivers that fed the earth above. Modern scholars generally interpret this as personification of natural forces, the god of water dwelling metaphorically in the source of water. But the archaeology at Eridu suggests the Sumerians may have meant something more literal. They built elaborate chambers at the exact point where fresh water emerged from beneath the earth. They maintained these spaces for thousands of years. They left evidence of activity, occupation and ritual that suggests the Abzu wasn't just believed in. It was a place you could descend to, a physical realm beneath the surface world, accessible through the temple of the god who ruled there. What purpose could such spaces serve? The official explanations centre on ritual and cosmology. The Abzu represented the source of life and fertility in Sumerian thought. Building chambers that connected to the actual underground water source made symbolic sense, allowing priests to perform rituals at the literal origin of the water that sustained their crops. The cool temperatures underground would have provided relief from summer heat. The mystery and isolation of the deep chambers would have created appropriate atmosphere for sacred rites involving the god of the deep. But these explanations, reasonable as they sound, don't quite account for scale. The chambers at Eridu weren't small ritual spaces. They were large enough for significant numbers of people. The construction quality suggests permanent rather than occasional use, and the pattern repeats at other sites, at Ur beneath the ziggurat, at Nippur beneath Enlil's temple, at Uruk beneath the temple of Anu. Every major Sumerian city shows evidence of this same practice, building down as well as up, creating elaborate underground spaces beneath the most sacred sites. Descending toward water or simply into the earth itself, the Sumerians were practical people. They invented writing to track commercial transactions. They developed mathematics to measure fields and calculate grain stores. They built irrigation systems of remarkable sophistication to control water in an unpredictable environment. Everything they did served clear purposes, solved real problems, addressed actual needs. So when they invested enormous resources in underground construction, when they applied their best engineering knowledge to creating permanent habitable spaces beneath the earth, they must have had practical reasons beyond ritual symbolism. Perhaps the Abzu, in Sumerian understanding, was both cosmic realm and physical refuge. Perhaps the watery deep beneath the earth represented safety, a place where Enki's protection was most powerful, where humans could withdraw when the surface world became dangerous. The texts describe Enki as humanity's defender, the god who warned Noah's Sumerian predecessor about the coming flood, who created humans and maintained sympathy for them, even when other Anunnaki wanted them destroyed. If danger came from heaven, from the sky where the Anunnaki originated, then perhaps depth offered protection. Perhaps going down into the earth, into Enki's realm, into the Abzu that existed both in myth and in the chambers beneath the temple, was the Sumerian equivalent of seeking sanctuary. The water itself may have held significance beyond sustenance. In Sumerian belief, the Abzu's waters possessed creative and protective power. Enki used them in the creation of humanity. Priests used water from sacred sources in purification rituals. Perhaps the Sumerians believed that being surrounded by the Abzu's waters, dwelling in the deep places where Enki's power was strongest, offered protection from forces that ruled the surface and the sky. But these remained questions without definitive answers, possibilities suggested by architecture that refused simple interpretation. The chambers were there, the water was there, the evidence of occupation was there. But the purpose, the reason why Sumer's first city built so deliberately toward the deep, remained obscured by centuries and silence. Among the thousands of cuneiform tablets recovered from Sumerian sites, certain texts describe the Anunnaki in terms that don't align with traditional concepts of benevolent gods. The Atrahasis epic, preserved in both Sumerian and later Akkadian versions, tells of a time when the Anunnaki grew disturbed by human noise and numbers, not metaphorically disturbed. The text is specific. Humanity multiplied, their noise grew unbearable, and the gods decided to reduce human population through plague, drought, and eventually flood. But before the flood, the text describes something curious. Enki, who had created humans, warned one man named Atrahasis. The warning wasn't just to build a boat. The text says Enki told him to quote 7 to abandon the surface world for something that would survive beneath or upon the waters. The Atrahasis epic dates to the Old Babylonian period, around 1700 BCE, but the story it tells reaches back into Sumerian tradition, to events the text places in the distant past, before the world as the Babylonians knew it existed. The narrative unfolds with bureaucratic precision. In the beginning, the text says, the great Anunnaki made the lesser gods, the Igigi, carry the workload. For 40 years the Igigi laboured, digging rivers, clearing channels, performing the constant work required to maintain the earth. Then they rebelled, burned their tools, and surrounded Enlil's house, demanding relief from endless labour. The Anunnaki Council gathered to address the crisis. Enlil wanted to punish the rebels. Enki proposed a solution: create a new being, humans, to take over the work the Igigi refused. The council agreed. Enki mixed clay with the blood of Wailu, the god who had led the rebellion and was slaughtered as punishment, and from this mixture shaped humanity. The text is explicit about human purpose. We were created to bear the labour of the gods, to dig their canals, tend their fields, build their cities, and provide the offerings that sustain divine existence. For a time, this arrangement functioned. Humans multiplied, cities rose, the earth flourished under human labour. The Anunnaki received their offerings and required nothing more from the Igigi. But then, the text says, 1200 years passed, and humanity had spread across the land. The text uses the word noise repeatedly. The clamour of human activity grew until the gods could not rest. Enlil heard the noise and grew angry. He called the council and proposed a solution: send plague to reduce human numbers. The plague came. Humanity suffered. But Enki quietly told Atrahasis, whose name means exceedingly wise, to have people stop worshipping all gods except Namtara, god of disease, concentrate all offerings to him alone. The strategy worked. Namtara, pleased with exclusive attention and abundant offerings, lifted the plague. Humanity recovered and continued to multiply. 1200 more years passed. Again the noise grew unbearable. Again Enlil called the council. This time he sent drought. For 6 years no rain fell, crops failed, humans starved. But again Enki intervened, telling Atrahasis to direct all offerings to Adad, god of storms. Adad, flattered and well-fed, brought rain. The drought ended, humanity recovered. By the 3rd time, Enlil's patience had ended. He made the council swear an oath that they would not warn humanity about what came next. He planned a flood so complete it would erase the human problem entirely. The text describes his determination with chilling clarity. This wasn't divine judgment on human sin. This was population control. Humans had become too numerous, too noisy, too much of a disturbance to divine peace. Elimination was the most efficient solution. But Enki, bound by his oath not to speak directly to humans, found a loophole. He spoke to the reed wall of Atrahasis' house, knowing the man stood on the other side listening. The text preserves Enki's words. Reed wall, pay attention to my words. Tear down your house, build a boat, spurn property and save life. The boat you build, roof it over like the Apsu, like the deep. Build something that references the watery realm beneath the earth, something that can survive by going beneath the surface. The instruction is peculiar. Why specify tearing down the house? Why emphasize abandoning property? The boat building itself makes sense if a flood is coming, but the text's insistence on complete abandonment of the surface world, on constructing something specifically patterned after the Abzu, suggests the flood wasn't simply rising water. It was something that made the surface world uninhabitable, something that required withdrawing entirely, either beneath the waters or sealed away from whatever moved above them. Atrahasis built the boat exactly as instructed. He loaded it with his family, animals, food and craftsmen of every trade. The text says he sealed the door with bitumen, making it watertight and airtight, a closed system that could sustain life without contact with the outside world. Then the flood came. The description is apocalyptic. For 7 days and nights the storm raged. The text says even the gods were frightened by what Enlil had unleashed, that they cowered like dogs and wept over the destruction of humanity. When the waters receded, Atrahasis emerged and made offerings. The gods, who had apparently not eaten during the flood, gathered around the sacrifice like flies, the text says, desperate for the sustenance that only humans could provide. Enlil arrived and grew furious that anyone had survived. Enki confessed his intervention, arguing that destroying all humanity was excessive, that if the gods had a problem with human noise, targeted solutions like plague or drought were more appropriate than complete genocide. The story ends with a compromise. Humanity would survive but with new limitations. Some women would be barren, some children would die young, demons would carry some away. Population would be controlled but not eliminated. The gods would have their workers, but the noise would be managed, and humanity, knowing now what the Anunnaki were capable of, what they had already done once and could do again, would remember to fear as well as worship. This is not a story about divine justice. It's not about human sin or moral failing. It's about noise, about numbers, about beings who created humans for a specific purpose, then grew annoyed when the creation became too successful, too numerous, too loud. And when annoyance turned to anger, the solution was extermination, stopped only by one dissenting god and the practical realization that eliminating humanity entirely meant the gods would lose their labor force and food supply. If the Sumerians believed this story, if they understood their relationship with the Anunnaki in these terms, then architecture that provided refuge, spaces where humans could withdraw beneath the earth, makes disturbing sense. Hundreds of miles northwest of Sumer, in what is now southeastern Turkey, archaeologists in 1994 discovered something that shattered assumptions about early civilization: Göbekli Tepe. A massive temple complex built around 9500 BCE, 6,000 years before Stonehenge, by people who supposedly hadn't yet invented agriculture or writing. But what struck archaeologists most was that Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. Not abandoned, not destroyed by enemies, carefully, methodically filled in with rubble and sand by the same people who built it, as if they were hiding it or sealing it away. Klaus Schmidt, who excavated the site until his death in 2014, had believed the builders buried it intentionally, though he could never determine why. The pillars, before they were buried, depicted animals and symbols that suggested the builders feared something from above. The discovery happened by accident, as so many archaeological breakthroughs do. A Kurdish shepherd noticed stones protruding from an artificial-looking mound. German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, surveying the area for prehistoric sites, recognized immediately that this was something extraordinary. The stones weren't natural, they were carved, shaped, arranged with clear intent. But their age seemed impossible. This was supposed to be the Stone Age, a time of simple hunter-gatherers living in small bands, lacking the organization, resources, or motivation to build monumental architecture. Yet here stood massive limestone pillars, some reaching 18 feet tall and weighing 16 tons, carved with intricate reliefs of animals, erected in circular arrangements within carefully constructed enclosures. The techniques required to quarry, transport, carve, and erect these pillars shouldn't have existed yet. More troubling, radiocarbon dating confirmed the impossible. Göbekli Tepe was built between 9600 and 8200 BCE, making it the oldest known temple complex in the world, predating pottery, metalworking, writing, and settled agriculture. Whoever built this worked with stone tools, moved massive blocks without wheels or draft animals, and created art of remarkable sophistication while still living as nomadic hunters. Schmidt spent 2 decades excavating and puzzling over Göbekli Tepe. The site covers 22 acres, only a fraction of which has been excavated. Ground-penetrating radar suggests at least 16 additional circular structures still buried beneath the hill. But what consumed Schmidt's thinking wasn't just the scale or age of the complex, it was the intentional burial. Someone, at some point between 8000 and 8200 BCE, decided to fill in the entire site. They didn't just abandon it, they carefully covered every structure with thousands of tons of rubble and soil, creating the artificial hill that preserved it until 1994. This wasn't destruction. Buried structures showed no evidence of damage. The pillars stood intact in their original positions. The enclosures remained organized. Someone had taken immense effort to preserve the site by hiding it, filling in the spaces around the pillars without toppling them, sealing everything away as if for future rediscovery. Schmidt called it, quote, 12, this deliberate act of preservation through concealment. The pillars themselves whisper of fear. The carvings show lions, or bulls, foxes, snakes, scorpions, and birds, rendered with artistic skill that rivals anything from the ancient world. But the arrangement suggests more than decoration. Many pillars show predators, dangerous animals, creatures associated with death or threat. Some reliefs show what appear to be headless human figures. Others show abstract symbols that resist interpretation. At the centre of most circular enclosures stand 2 larger pillars, T-shaped, broader at the top, with carved arms at their sides that suggest they represent stylized humans, or at least humanoid forms. What were the builders commemorating? What drove people without agriculture to organize labour on this scale, to create a complex that must have required generations to complete? And why, after investing such extraordinary effort, did they bury it all? Schmidt proposed that Göbekli Tepe represented humanity's first temple, a pilgrimage site where scattered hunting bands gathered for ritual purposes. The effort of building it, he suggested, may have driven the development of agriculture, as feeding workers required reliable food sources. But this explanation doesn't address the burial. If Göbekli Tepe was sacred, why hide it? If it was a triumph of human achievement, why seal it away as if it were dangerous or forbidden? Some researchers have noted the astronomical alignments in the structures. Certain pillars align with the rising of Sirius, others point towards solstice positions. The builders were clearly observing the sky with purpose, tracking celestial movements with enough precision to encode them in stone. But there's a difference between watching the sky with wonder and watching it with wariness. The prevalence of predator imagery, the deliberate burial, the massive effort to create something and then hide it, all suggest Göbekli Tepe may have been as much memorial as temple, a marker of something the builders feared might return. The site's age places it roughly contemporary with the end of the Younger Dryas, a period of rapid climate change between 10,800 and 9600 BCE. Global temperatures rose dramatically. Ice sheets melted, sea levels surged, ecosystems collapsed and reformed. For humans living through this, the world itself must have seemed unstable, as if something had broken the natural order. If Göbekli Tepe was built in response to this environmental catastrophe, its careful burial might represent an attempt to seal away knowledge of whatever had caused such devastation, or to hide evidence of how the builders had survived. The connection to Sumerian underground construction is speculative but intriguing. Göbekli Tepe predated Sumer by 6,000 years, different culture, different geography, different context entirely, yet both show evidence of sophisticated construction knowledge appearing suddenly in the archaeological record. Both involve massive effort to build underground or to bury structures. Both suggest people felt the need to create spaces of protection or concealment, and both involve careful attention to the sky, as if watching for something specific. When the builders of Göbekli Tepe finally buried their creation, they didn't smash the pillars or deface the carvings. They preserved everything intact, as if leaving a message for whoever might one day uncover it. The message remains unclear, obscured by millennia and the absence of writing. But the act itself speaks across time. These people built something extraordinary, then chose to hide it beneath the earth, sealing away knowledge they had gone to tremendous trouble to preserve in stone. Perhaps what they feared came to pass and made the surface world too dangerous for such monuments. Perhaps they succeeded in hiding until the danger passed. Or perhaps they were sealing away warning for a future they hoped would never need to understand what they had survived. The pillars wait beneath the Turkish plain, most still unexcavated, holding questions we've barely begun to ask. When Leonard Woolley excavated the royal cemetery of in the 1920s, he found evidence of wealth and sophistication that rivaled anything in ancient Egypt. But beneath the cemetery he found something else. A network of brick-vaulted chambers and passages that predated the burials above. The construction technique alone puzzled him. These weren't crude tunnels dug by grave robbers. They were precisely engineered spaces, their vaulted ceilings designed to bear enormous weight, as if the builders anticipated something pressing down from above. The chambers connected to the temple complex of Nana, the moon god, but their purpose remained unclear. Woolley's notes, preserved in the British Museum archives, record his observation that these spaces showed evidence of long-term occupation, though he couldn't determine when or why people had lived in them. Woolley came to expecting burials. The site was known to contain a royal cemetery, and his sponsor, the British Museum, wanted treasures and artefacts that would rival the Egyptian discoveries capturing public imagination. What Woolley delivered exceeded expectations. The standard of gold helmets, elaborate lyres decorated with bull heads of lapis lazuli and gold, and evidence of burial practices so elaborate they suggested human sacrifice on a massive scale. The royal tombs contained not just the deceased ruler, but entire retinues of attendants, guards, and musicians, all apparently walking to their deaths willingly, dressed in their finest clothes, taking poison or being sealed alive in the tomb to serve their sovereign in the afterlife. These discoveries made headlines. They filled museum galleries. They established as one of the ancient world's most sophisticated civilizations. But in Woolley's private notes, in the detailed journals he kept throughout the excavation, another discovery troubled him more than the spectacular burials. Beneath the cemetery level, predating the royal tombs by centuries, he found spaces that shouldn't exist. The chambers were empty when he found them. Whatever they had contained, if anything, had long since vanished or turned to dust. But the architecture itself told stories. The brickwork showed the same quality as Ur's finest above-ground structures. The vault construction demonstrated sophisticated understanding of engineering principles. These weren't storage cellars or crude shelters. They were permanent architecture, built to last, built to protect. What struck Woolley most was how the vaults were designed. The ceiling arches weren't just functional. They were overbuilt, stronger than necessary for simple underground rooms. The walls were thick, multiple layers of brick where single layers would have sufficed, and the passages connecting the chambers showed evidence of doors or gates that could be sealed from within. Someone had created these spaces with defence in mind, or at least with the expectation that whatever pressed down from above would be substantial. The chambers connected through a complex series of passages to the temple precinct of Nanna, the moon god who was Ur's patron deity. Nanna's ziggurat dominated the city, a massive stepped pyramid that could be seen for miles across the flat Mesopotamian plain. But beneath that symbol of reaching toward heaven, these chambers descended into earth, creating a mirror architecture of depth rather than height. Woolley documented the chambers thoroughly. He noted the traces of soot on walls that suggested lamps or torches had burned there. He found pottery fragments that dated the construction to Ur's earliest periods, contemporary with the city's founding. He recorded evidence of foot traffic, wear patterns on floors and thresholds that spoke of regular use over extended time, but he found no artifacts that clearly indicated purpose, no storage jars, no ritual objects, no burials, just empty spaces that showed people had been there, had lived there, had used these underground rooms for something important enough to justify their elaborate construction. His notes record his puzzlement. Storage didn't require such elaborate vaulting. Ritual spaces didn't need such thick walls. Tombs showed clear evidence of their purpose. These chambers showed only absence, as if they had been deliberately emptied at some point, cleared of whatever had made them necessary. Woolley proposed several theories in his published reports. Perhaps they were early storage facilities later abandoned. Perhaps they served some ritual function now lost to understanding. Perhaps they were simply architectural experimentation by early builders testing vault construction techniques. But in his private correspondence, preserved in the British Museum's archives, Woolley admitted doubt. The construction was too sophisticated to be experimental. The connection to the temple precinct was too deliberate to be coincidental, and the evidence of long-term occupation suggested these weren't occasionally used ritual spaces but places where people had spent significant time, had lived beneath the earth while the city thrived above. One detail particularly troubled him. In several chambers, he found what appeared to be ventilation shafts, narrow passages that led upward toward the surface but didn't quite reach it. They stopped short, still underground, their upper ends carefully sealed, as if the builders wanted fresh air but didn't want to create any opening that would connect the chambers directly to the world above. As if they were designing spaces where people could breathe and live but remain completely sealed off from the surface. Woolley left Ur in 1934 after 12 seasons of excavation. He had uncovered treasures that transformed understanding of Sumerian civilization. But the chambers beneath the cemetery remained unexplained, catalogued and documented but ultimately mysterious, evidence of Sumerian priorities that modern archaeology couldn't quite interpret. Among the administrative and economic texts that make up the majority of recovered cuneiform tablets, occasional passages stand out for their apocalyptic imagery. The Sumerian king list, which chronicles rulers and dynasties with bureaucratic precision, begins with a statement that still unsettles scholars. _quote, _13, _not established, not created, lowered, as if authority came from above, granted by the Anunnaki, and could presumably be withdrawn. But other texts are more explicit about celestial danger. Astronomical tablets from the library at Nippur contain observations of the sky, mixed with warnings about quote 14 and quote 15. These weren't astrological superstitions. The Sumerians were accurate astronomers who tracked celestial mechanics with precision. Their warnings about the sky carried the same matter-of-fact tone as their grain inventories. The Sumerian king list is one of ancient history's strangest documents. It begins with the assertion that kingship descended from heaven to the city of Eridu, then proceeds to list rulers and their reigns with mathematical precision. But the early kings, the ones who ruled before the flood, have reign lengths that defy credibility. Alulim of Eridu ruled for 28,800 years. Alaljar ruled for 36,000 years. 8 kings, the text claims, ruled for a total of 241,200 years before the flood swept everything away. Modern scholars treat these numbers as mythological or symbolic, attempts to express immense antiquity through exaggeration. But the text itself makes no distinction between the antediluvian kings and the later, more plausibly dated rulers. It lists them in the same bureaucratic format, using the same language, maintaining the same matter-of-fact tone throughout, and it insists repeatedly that kingship was quote 16, as if this were historical fact requiring no explanation or justification. The phrase troubles translators. The Sumerian word translated as quote 17 doesn't mean established or created. It specifically indicates movement downward from above. Something existed in heaven, and the gods brought it down to earth, granting it to the city of Eridu first, then allowing it to move to other cities as dynasties rose and fell. Kingship, in the Sumerian understanding, wasn't a human invention or natural development. It was divine technology, granted from above, and the text phrasing suggests it could presumably be withdrawn the same way. But it's the astronomical texts that carry more immediate menace. The Sumerians were exceptional astronomers. They tracked Venus with such accuracy that modern astronomers can use their observations to date historical events. They identified the planets, distinguished them from stars, and mapped their movements across the sky. They understood the precession of equinoxes, that slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes 25,800 years to complete one cycle. Their mathematical astronomy was sophisticated enough to predict eclipses and planetary positions. This wasn't casual sky watching. This was systematic observation over generations, knowledge accumulated and refined with the same precision the Sumerians applied to everything. And woven through these astronomical observations are warnings that read very differently from typical astrological omens. The texts don't just say, when Venus appears in the east the king will prosper. They describe specific celestial events in terms of terror and catastrophe. One tablet from Nippur's library, translated by Assyriologist Hermann Hunger, contains a passage describing a time, quote, 21, quote, the text places this event in the distant past, before the current order of things, before the flood that divided history. But it describes it with the same precise language used for contemporary astronomical observations, as if recording actual phenomena rather than mythological imagery. Other tablets warn of, quote, 22 that appear in the wrong positions, that disturb the natural order. They describe days when the sky itself seemed wrong, when celestial mechanics didn't follow their usual patterns. Modern readers might dismiss these as misunderstandings or superstition, except that the Sumerians clearly understood normal celestial mechanics with impressive accuracy. When they describe something as abnormal, as wrong in the sky, they're comparing it to a baseline of precise knowledge. The warnings carry a specific quality. They don't describe divine punishment or moral judgment. They describe physical phenomena, shaking, darkness, disruption of normal patterns, and they describe fear, not reverence. The texts say, when heaven and earth trembled, using words that indicate violent motion, instability, breakdown of the expected order. Whatever the Sumerians saw or believed their ancestors had seen, it was something that made the sky itself dangerous. Some tablets link these celestial disturbances directly to the Anunnaki. They describe the gods descending or departing, and the sky responding with violence. As if the movement of divine beings through the heavens wasn't invisible or spiritual, but had physical effects, caused observable disruption, made the natural world react with trembling and darkness. The astronomical libraries at Nippur contained thousands of tablets. Most record routine observations, the phases of Venus, the movements of Mars and Jupiter, the timing of lunar eclipses, standard scientific astronomy. Ancient but accurate. But scattered among these routine records are the warnings, the descriptions of times when the sky stopped being predictable and became threatening. The scribes who maintained these libraries preserved both kinds of knowledge with equal care, as if understanding normal celestial mechanics and remembering the times when those mechanics failed were equally important. For a civilization that watched the sky so carefully, that tracked the movements of planets and stars with such dedication, the warnings suggest a specific kind of vigilance, not wonder at the heavens' beauty, not simple curiosity about celestial phenomena, but watching, careful watching, as if checking to make sure the sky remained safe, that whatever had caused the trembling and darkness their ancestors recorded didn't return. The oldest known flood narrative doesn't come from the Bible, but from a fragmented Sumerian tablet found at Nippur, dated to around 1600 BCE, but describing events the text claims occurred far earlier. The Eridu Genesis tells of how the gods created humans, how humanity multiplied and built cities, and how the gods eventually decided to destroy them with a flood. But the fragment that survives contains a detail absent from later versions. Before the flood, the text describes people being warned to go into the earth for protection. The passage is damaged, frustratingly incomplete, but the surviving signs suggest underground refuge, not just a boat floating on surface waters. Samuel Noah Kramer, who translated many of these early texts, noted the peculiarity but couldn't resolve it with other known Sumerian beliefs. The tablet that preserves the Eridu Genesis is heartbreakingly incomplete. Found in fragments at Nippur, it consists of portions of 6 columns, with significant gaps where the clay broke or eroded over 3,500 years. What survives reads like the outline of a much longer story. Key phrases and moments preserved while connecting passages have vanished, but even in fragmentary form it tells the oldest version of humanity's near extinction, the story that would later become the epic of Gilgamesh's flood narrative, then the biblical story of Noah. The text begins with creation. The gods lowered kingship from heaven to Eridu. They established 5 cities: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. They assigned each city to a patron deity. Humanity multiplied and filled these cities with life and noise. Then, after a passage now lost, the tablet describes divine consultation. The gods gathered. They discussed the problem of humanity. And they decided on the flood. But here's where the Eridu Genesis diverges from later versions. Before describing the flood itself, the damaged text contains a passage that Samuel Noah Kramer struggled to translate definitively. The signs suggest a warning given to humanity, or at least to certain people, and the warning, as best Kramer could reconstruct, instructed them to go down, to descend, to seek protection in the earth, rather than upon the waters. The passage is too damaged to be certain. Later translators have suggested alternative readings. Some argue the signs refer to going into a boat, that the instruction about earth is misunderstood or incorrectly reconstructed. But Kramer, who dedicated his life to Sumerian translation and understood the language's nuances better than almost anyone, believed the text said something about underground refuge. He noted the peculiarity in his translation notes, but couldn't reconcile it with the flood narrative everyone knew, where salvation came through floating above the waters, not hiding beneath the earth. What if both were true? What if the Sumerian understanding of the flood involved multiple survival strategies? A boat for some, underground refuge for others. The later Babylonian versions that streamlined the story into a single arc and single family surviving might have simplified a more complex original memory. The Eridu Genesis, fragmented as it is, might preserve an earlier, more complete version where different people found different ways to survive. The text breaks off just as it begins describing the flood itself. When the fragments resume, the flood has ended. A king named Ziusudra, whose name means life of long days, has survived. He makes offerings to the gods. They grant him eternal life and settle him in Dilmun, the paradise island in the east. The familiar conclusion. But the gap, the missing columns that should describe the flood itself, may have contained details later versions omitted or forgot. Other Sumerian texts hint at underground survival during catastrophes. Medical texts describe people sheltering in the deep places during plagues. Administrative documents from record supplies being moved below during emergencies, though the texts don't specify below what or for what purpose. Hymns to Enki praise his protection in the Abzu, in the watery deep beneath the earth, describing it as refuge from _quote_30_. These references, scattered and contextually unclear, suggest the Sumerians had a concept of underground refuge that ran parallel to their flood narratives. The idea appears often enough to indicate it wasn't isolated or unusual. Going beneath the earth during danger seems to have been a recognised strategy, a known practice that texts mention casually, assuming readers would understand. But later cultures lost this understanding. The Babylonians, who inherited Sumerian traditions, focused on the ark narrative. The biblical authors who drew from Babylonian sources retained only the boat. The protective earth, the refuge below, disappeared from the story, surviving only in fragments too damaged to tell us clearly what the Sumerians actually believed and practiced. Kramer spent years trying to reconstruct the missing portions of the Eridu Genesis. He cross-referenced other flood narratives, examined parallel passages in better-preserved texts, and applied his deep knowledge of Sumerian grammar and vocabulary to guess at what the damaged sections might have said. But the gaps remained stubbornly empty. The earth had claimed those words, dissolved the clay that held them, leaving only enough to raise questions without providing answers. In the end, Kramer published his translation with extensive notes, acknowledging uncertainty. He believed the text said something about underground refuge, but he couldn't prove it definitively. The fragments whispered of people going down into the earth while the flood came, but whether as primary survival strategy or supplementary protection, whether for everyone or just some, the broken tablet wouldn't say. Sumerian cosmology centered on 7 great Anunnaki who held the power to decree fate for both gods and humans. Their names appear consistently across thousands of years of texts: Anu, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Nana, Utu, and Inanna. But what fascinated archaeologists wasn't their names, but their described behaviour. These weren't distant, invisible forces. The texts describe them gathering in assemblies, making decisions, disagreeing with each other, and directly intervening in human affairs. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes Ishtar, Inanna, becoming furious when the hero Gilgamesh rejects her advances, prompting her to send the Bull of Heaven to destroy Uruk. The text doesn't frame this as allegory. It describes physical destruction, casualties counted in hundreds, and Gilgamesh's very real terror of divine retribution. The number 7 carried special significance in Sumerian thought. 7 sages brought civilization to humanity. 7 gates led to the underworld. And 7 great Anunnaki sat in judgment over the fates of all beings. This wasn't arbitrary numerology. The texts consistently identify these 7 as the highest authorities in the cosmos, the beings whose decisions shaped reality itself. Anu, whose name simply means, quote, 31 ruled from heaven, and rarely intervened directly in earthly affairs. He was authority personified, the ultimate source of power, but distant and mostly unconcerned with human problems. When the texts describe Anu acting, it's usually in response to appeals from other gods rather than human prayer. He represents the remote sovereign who delegates actual governance to subordinates. Enlil, lord of the air and storms, commanded the space between heaven and earth. He was the executive authority, the god who made most decisions affecting humanity. The texts describe him as powerful but often harsh, quick to anger, and inclined toward violent solutions. In the flood narratives, Enlil advocates for complete destruction of humanity. In other texts, he sends plagues and famines as punishment for human noise. Yet he was also the god who granted kingship, who established law and order, who maintained the structures that allowed civilization to function. Enki, the craftsman god who dwelt in the Abzu, served as the counterbalance to Enlil's severity. The texts consistently portray Enki as clever, sympathetic to humans, willing to work around other gods' harsh decrees. He created humanity. He taught them skills and knowledge. He warned select individuals about coming disasters. The texts describe a running tension between Enlil and Enki, between harsh order and merciful cleverness, with humanity caught between them. Ninhursag, the mother goddess, appears less frequently but carries enormous authority when she acts. The texts credit her with shaping the first humans alongside Enki, with healing both gods and humans, with determining fertility and birth. Her name means Lady of the Sacred Mountain, and texts describe her dwelling in high places, separate from the male god's constant politics. Nanna, the moon god who ruled controlled the passage of time through the lunar cycle. Texts describe him as calm, measured, less involved in the dramatic conflicts that consumed other gods. But his temple at received the most elaborate offerings. Suggesting his worship was central to Sumerian religious practice, even if his mythological role was less dramatic. Utu, the sun god, served as divine judge and maintained justice. Texts describe him seeing everything beneath his light, knowing all secrets, punishing the wicked and protecting the righteous. The Epic of Gilgamesh shows him directly intervening to help the heroes, sending winds to aid them in battle. A rare instance of divine assistance given freely rather than in response to offerings or favour. And then there was Inanna, goddess of love and war, the planet Venus, the most unpredictable and dangerous of the seven. The texts portray her as passionate, vengeful, ambitious, and powerful enough to challenge the other gods. Her mythology is dramatic and violent. She descends to the underworld and returns. She destroys lovers who displease her. She demands worship and punishes cities that refuse her. When Gilgamesh rejects her sexual advances, citing her history of destroying previous partners, she responds by convincing her father Anu to send the Bull of Heaven to destroy Uruk. This isn't allegory. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes the Bull of Heaven in specific terms. It breathed and created massive craters. Hundreds of men fell into them and died. It caused destruction across the city until Gilgamesh and Enkidu killed it. The text counts casualties. It describes the terror of the population. It shows Gilgamesh's desperate fight against a creature sent by a goddess whose pride he had wounded. This is physical violence, divine retribution, manifesting as actual destruction that required actual heroism to overcome. The point isn't whether these events literally happened. The point is that Sumerians described their gods acting with physical consequence in the physical world. When Inanna grew angry, people died. When Enlil sent a flood, cities drowned. When Enki intervened, specific humans received specific warnings that allowed specific survival. These weren't abstractions or metaphors. They were, in the Sumerian understanding, real beings whose decisions had immediate, concrete effects on human existence. The texts describe these seven gathering an assembly to make important decisions, just as human councils gathered to decide city business. They debated, they disagreed, they formed factions and alliances. Enki often argued against Enlil's harsh proposals. Ninhursag sometimes supported Enki, sometimes remained neutral. Inanna pursued her own interests regardless of what the council decided. The dynamics read like court politics, not theology, and if this was how Sumerians understood divine governance, if the gods who controlled their fate were powerful individuals with distinct personalities and conflicting agendas, then human vulnerability becomes starkly clear. You couldn't just worship and expect protection. You had to navigate divine politics, try to please multiple gods whose interests might conflict, and hope that when the assembly gathered to decree your fate, the merciful voices outnumbered the harsh ones. And when they didn't, when the assembly decreed destruction, your only hope was that one god might secretly help you, might tell you how to build a boat or where to hide, might give you a chance to survive what the council had ordained. One of the most striking features of Sumerian architecture is the practice of building new temples directly on top of old ones, creating massive artificial mounds called tells. Archaeologists initially assumed this was simple urban development, cities rebuilding on their own ruins over centuries. But the pattern is too consistent, too deliberate. At Eridu, excavators found 18 successive temple layers, each built directly above the previous one, dating back to around 5500 BCE. The temples grew larger with each rebuild, but they also grew taller, as if reaching higher was essential. Meanwhile, the sacred precincts showed evidence of increasingly elaborate underground construction, as if the Sumerians were simultaneously reaching toward heaven and burrowing into the earth, creating architecture that acknowledged threats from both directions. The tell at Eridu rises more than 40 feet above the surrounding plain, entirely artificial, entirely the result of 5,000 years of building temples on temples. When Seton Lloyd excavated the site in the 1940s, he found he could read Sumerian architectural evolution like a book, each layer representing a specific period, showing how construction techniques developed and temple designs evolved. But what struck him most was the consistency of purpose. Every single temple, from the earlier small shrine to the massive final structure, stood on exactly the same spot, oriented in exactly the same direction, serving exactly the same deity. This wasn't convenient reuse of ruins. This was deliberate, ritual rebuilding. At some point, possibly at regular intervals, the Sumerians would carefully fill in their existing temple with clean sand, creating a level platform, then build a new temple directly on top. The old temple wasn't destroyed or desecrated. It was preserved beneath the new construction, sealed away intact, while the new structure rose higher. The practice created tells throughout Mesopotamia. Every major Sumerian city sits atop massive artificial mounds built from layer upon layer of previous occupation. Modern cities in Iraq still sit atop these ancient tells, their foundations resting on thousands of years of human construction. But the temple tells are different. They show systematic, deliberate raising of sacred platforms, as if altitude itself held religious significance. Why build higher? The standard explanation centers on flooding. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flooded regularly, and raising platforms above flood level made practical sense. Temples built on tells would remain accessible even when surrounding areas were underwater. But this explanation doesn't account for the scale. The temples at Eridu rose far higher than necessary to avoid floods, and the pattern continued even in later periods when flood control improved and the practical need diminished. The ziggurat, the iconic stepped pyramid of Mesopotamian architecture, represents the ultimate expression of this upward building impulse. These weren't tombs like Egyptian pyramids. They were artificial mountains, platforms built specifically to elevate a temple as high as possible. The ziggurat at Ur, partially reconstructed in the 1970s, still rises more than 60 feet. In antiquity, it would have stood at least 70 feet tall, dominating the flat landscape for miles in every direction. The text describes ziggurats as connecting points between heaven and earth, stairways for the gods to descend. Each ziggurat had a temple at the summit where the deity could dwell when visiting from heaven. The architecture was functional. If gods descended from the sky, they needed a high place to land, a platform close to heaven's realm. But this raises the question of why the Sumerians thought gods needed physical architecture at all. Why would beings capable of descending from heaven need stairs? Why would they require landing platforms? Unless the descent wasn't miraculous but physical. Unless the gods arrived in ways that required actual infrastructure. Unless descending from heaven described a process that needed accommodation through built environment. Meanwhile, beneath these ever-rising temples, the underground construction grew more elaborate. As the temples reached higher, the foundations reached deeper. At Eridu, the deepest chambers descended over 30 feet below ground level, penetrating the water table, creating spaces that had to be constantly maintained against seepage and collapse. The effort required to build and maintain such deep constructions suggests it wasn't simply foundation work, but served specific purposes that justified the engineering challenges. The pattern suggests a civilization caught between two directions, reaching upward to accommodate gods who came from above, burrowing downward to create refuge from something that threatened from the same direction. Not contradiction, but acknowledgement of complex reality. The Anunnaki were powerful, necessary, the source of kingship and civilization. But they were also dangerous, capable of deciding to destroy what they had created, requiring humans to maintain dual architecture of approach and retreat. Other cultures built high temples. The Maya created pyramids. The Egyptians built monuments reaching toward the sky. But only the Sumerians combined this upward reaching with such elaborate underground construction. Only they created architecture that simultaneously honoured and feared the sky, that invited descent while preparing for hiding. The excavations continue. Every year, archaeologists uncover more layers, more evidence of how extensively the Sumerians built both up and down. Ground-penetrating radar reveals structures still buried, chambers and passages that haven't seen light in 4,000 years. Some sites can't be fully excavated because modern cities sit on top of them, their populations unknowingly living above the sealed temples and hidden chambers of the world's first civilization. But what's already been found establishes the pattern clearly enough. The Sumerians invested extraordinary resources in building toward the sky and into the earth. They raised platforms higher than floods required. They dug chambers deeper than storage needed. They created architecture that acknowledged two directions of danger, two realms requiring attention, heaven above, where the Anunnaki originated, and earth below, where humans might hide when the gods grew angry enough to destroy. In the ruins of Kish, one of the oldest Sumerian cities, archaeologists in the early 20th century found tablets describing technologies that seemed impossibly advanced for the period. Not fantastic inventions, but practical knowledge about metallurgy, agriculture, and astronomy that appeared suddenly in the archaeological record without precedent or development. The tablets attribute this knowledge directly to the Anunnaki, specifically to Enki, who the texts say taught humanity the arts of civilization. Modern scholars usually interpret this as mythological explanation for cultural development, but the sudden appearance of writing, advanced mathematics, astronomical knowledge, and sophisticated agriculture in Sumer around 3200 BCE remains one of archaeology's persistent mysteries. These innovations didn't develop gradually. They appeared fully formed, as if taught rather than discovered. The excavations at Kish began in 1912 when a joint French and British expedition started uncovering one of Sumer's most ancient settlements. The city dates to the early dynastic period, around 3200 BCE, right at the moment when Sumerian civilization suddenly crystallized into recognizable form. What the archaeologists found there astonished them. Not primitive beginnings, but sophisticated achievement from the very start. The tablets from Kish's earliest levels contain mathematical tables, astronomical observations, metallurgical formulas, and agricultural instructions that demonstrate advanced understanding. These aren't tentative first attempts at these technologies. They're refined, polished systems that show no evidence of trial and error, no gradual development from simpler forms. The mathematics is already sophisticated, using a base 60 number system that allows complex calculations. The astronomical observations are already accurate, tracking planetary movements with precision that would take other cultures thousands of years to achieve. The metallurgy is already advanced, describing alloy ratios and temperature controls that should have required generations of experimentation to perfect. Where did this knowledge come from? Traditional archaeological theory holds that technologies develop gradually. Simple tools precede complex ones. Basic agriculture evolves into sophisticated irrigation. Early counting systems slowly develop into mathematics. But Sumer violates this pattern. Around 3200 BCE, in the span of perhaps 2 or 3 generations, we see the simultaneous appearance of writing, mathematics, astronomy, advanced agriculture, sophisticated architecture, complex legal systems, and organized religion. It's as if someone flipped a switch and civilization suddenly existed, where previously there had been only scattered farming villages. The tablets themselves attribute this knowledge transfer directly to Enki. They describe him teaching humans the arts of civilization, writing, numbers, metalworking, building, farming. The texts don't frame this as inspiration or divine blessing, but as actual instruction, as if Enki personally taught humans these skills. Later Babylonian texts expand on this, describing 7 antediluvian sages called the Apkallu, who emerged from the sea and taught humanity everything necessary for civilization. These weren't angels or spirits, but physical beings who appeared, taught, and then departed, leaving humans with knowledge they shouldn't yet have possessed. Modern scholars dismiss this as myth, as ancient people creating stories to explain cultural development they didn't actually understand. But the archaeological evidence of sudden, simultaneous advancement remains troubling. Something caused Sumerian civilization to appear fully formed rather than gradually developing. Whether that something was cultural diffusion from an unknown earlier civilization, or rapid indigenous development driven by environmental pressures, or something else entirely, the texts themselves insist it was teaching, knowledge transferred from the Anunnaki to humans. Consider the sophistication of early Sumerian astronomy. They tracked all 5 visible planets. They understood the ecliptic, the path of the sun and planets across the sky. They knew the lunar cycle precisely enough to create a calendar that remained in use for 3,000 years. They recognized that Venus's morning and evening appearances were the same celestial body, something Greek astronomers wouldn't understand until much later. All of this knowledge appears in the earliest texts, already complete, already systematized. Or consider their mathematics. The base 60 system seems arbitrary until you understand its advantages. 60 is divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, making it extraordinarily useful for practical calculations involving fractions and divisions. Someone designed this system deliberately, understanding its mathematical properties and advantages. It wasn't stumbled upon, it was crafted. The metallurgy tablets from Kish describe bronze production with precise ratios, specific amounts of copper and tin, specific furnace temperatures, specific cooling processes. This knowledge requires understanding not just how to work metal, but why metals behave as they do, requiring grasp of principles that seem beyond what early civilization should have possessed. Yet there it is, written on tablets from Sumer's earliest period, complete and functional. The agricultural texts demonstrate understanding of irrigation engineering, crop rotation, soil management, and seasonal planting that should have taken centuries of trial and error to develop. Instead, it appears immediately, allowing Sumer to support urban populations much larger than simpler agriculture could feed. and binding it all together, writing. Not pictographic writing that slowly develops into phonetic systems, but cuneiform, already sophisticated, already capable of expressing complex abstract thoughts, legal concepts, mathematical notation, and administrative detail. The earliest readable tablets show a writing system that's already functional, already serving multiple purposes, already refined enough for literature and law. The texts say Enki taught all this. The archaeology shows it appearing suddenly rather than developing gradually. And modern scholarship, uncomfortable with both explanations, generally avoids the question, focusing on documenting what happened rather than explaining how or why it happened so quickly. But if we take the Sumerian texts seriously, if we consider that they meant what they said about being taught by the Anunnaki, then the sudden appearance of advanced knowledge makes a different kind of sense. Not miraculous, not supernatural, but perhaps not entirely indigenous human development either. Before the Anunnaki created humans, Sumerian texts describe another class of beings called the Igigi, younger gods forced to labour for the great Anunnaki. The Atrahasis epic tells how the Igigi rebelled against this forced labour, burning their tools and confronting Enlil with their grievances. The solution, according to the text, was the creation of humans to take over the labour the Igigi refused. But what archaeologists found interesting was the implication: if the Anunnaki needed workers, if they required physical labour performed, then they weren't purely spiritual beings, they had material needs. And if humans were created specifically to serve those needs, the relationship between gods and humans was transactional, not worshipful. This raised uncomfortable questions about what Sumerians actually believed they were dealing with. The Igigi appear in multiple Sumerian and Akkadian texts, always in the same role: lesser deities forced to perform the physical work required to maintain creation. The Atrahasis epic is most explicit about their situation. The text describes how the Anunnaki, after establishing order in the cosmos, assigned the Igigi to dig rivers, dredge channels, and perform the constant labour required to make the earth habitable and productive. The work was hard. The text says they laboured for 40 years, digging with tools, carrying earth, shaping the landscape. Then they rebelled. The text describes it almost like a labour strike. The Igigi gathered, burned their tools, and marched to Enlil's dwelling in the middle of the night. They surrounded his house and demanded an end to their forced labour. Enlil, frightened and angry, called the Council of Great Anunnaki to address the crisis. The gods debated what to do. Enlil wanted to punish the rebels. Anu suggested finding out who had instigated the rebellion and executing them as an example. But Enki proposed a different solution. Create a new being to take over the work. The text is specific about human creation. Enki had the god slaughter Wiilu, the god who had led the rebellion. They mixed his blood and flesh with clay, and from this mixture shaped humanity. The blood and flesh gave humans intelligence and strength. The clay gave them mortality and connection to earth, and the purpose was explicit. Humans were created to bear the burden of the gods. To perform the labour the Igigi refused to do, this creation story troubles modern sensibilities because it's so transactional. Humans weren't created out of love or for spiritual purposes. We were created to solve a labour problem. We exist to work, to maintain the earth, to provide for divine needs. The Sumerian texts don't sugarcoat this. They state it plainly, repeatedly, as if it were obvious fact requiring no justification. But what makes this narrative archaeologically interesting is what it implies about the Anunnaki themselves. If they needed workers, they had physical needs. If they required labour to maintain their world, they weren't omnipotent. If younger gods could rebel and demand better treatment, then divine hierarchy operated through power dynamics rather than an inherent spiritual authority. The Anunnaki, in this telling, sound less like transcendent deities and more like powerful beings with material requirements and political structures. The Igigi's rebellion suggests the work was genuinely difficult, that even divine beings found it burdensome enough to risk punishment by refusing. and the Anunnaki's response, creating humans rather than simply compelling the Igigi to continue, suggests their power had limits. They couldn't just force compliance. They had to negotiate, compromise, find alternative solutions. This makes the entire relationship between Anunnaki and humans different from typical religious frameworks. The gods didn't create humans to worship them. Worship came later, as a way humans could gain divine favour, but it wasn't the original purpose. Humans were created to work. The temples weren't primarily houses of worship but administrative centres, where human labour was organised and divine needs were met. The offerings weren't gifts to transcendent beings, but payment for services, sustenance for gods who apparently needed feeding. Archaeological evidence supports this transactional understanding. Temple complexes in Sumer functioned as economic centres. They owned fields and employed workers. They maintained workshops where craftsmen produced goods. They stored grain and distributed rations. They organised labour for irrigation projects. The temples weren't separate from economic life but central to it, managing the work that sustained both human and divine existence. The texts describe daily temple rituals in explicitly practical terms. The god statue was washed, dressed, fed specific meals at specific times. The temple staff maintained the god's dwelling, kept it clean, provided fresh water, offered entertainment through music and dance. These descriptions read like instructions for caring for a physical being, not metaphorical worship of an abstract deity. If this was how Sumerians understood their gods, if the Anunnaki were powerful beings with physical needs who had created humans to serve those needs, then the archaeological evidence of elaborate temple infrastructure makes sense. The gods needed housing because they actually occupied those spaces. They needed feeding because they actually consumed the offerings. They needed human labour because they had tasks that required doing and preferred not to do them personally. And if this was the relationship, then human vulnerability becomes stark. You serve beings powerful enough to create you, powerful enough to destroy you if you fail to serve adequately, powerful enough to decide your entire species is making too much noise and needs to be eliminated. The relationship isn't love. It's not worship in any comforting spiritual sense. It's employment under employers who hold absolute power over your existence. Which brings us back to those underground chambers. If you serve powerful beings who have already decided once to destroy humanity, who created you for a specific purpose and might eliminate you if that purpose changes, then building spaces where you can hide, where you can withdraw from their sight, where you might survive if they turn hostile again, becomes not paranoia but reasonable precaution. The massive stepped pyramids called ziggurats dominated every Sumerian city, their platforms rising in stages toward the sky. Traditional interpretation holds they were symbolic mountains, places where earth and heaven met, where priests could commune with the gods. But the actual construction of ziggurats suggests something more specific. Each had a temple platform at the summit, but archaeological evidence shows these summit temples were maintained constantly, provisioned regularly, as if someone actually lived there or visited frequently enough to require permanent facilities. The ziggurat at Ur, excavated by Leonard Woolley, had fresh water channels leading to the summit, storage rooms for food, and chambers that showed evidence of regular occupation. These weren't symbolic structures. They were functional architecture built to accommodate physical presence. The ziggurat at Ur, even in its partially ruined state, dominates the landscape. Its base covers roughly 200 feet by 140 feet. In antiquity, it rose in 3 stages to a height of at least 70 feet, possibly more. Modern reconstructions suggest the final structure may have reached over 90 feet, a mountain of mud brick rising from the flat plain, visible for miles in every direction. Leonard Woolley spent years excavating this structure in the 1920s and 30s. What he found challenged simple interpretations of ziggurats as symbolic architecture. The summit temple, dedicated to Nana the moon god, wasn't a small shrine for occasional rituals. It was a substantial building with multiple rooms, storage areas, and facilities that suggested regular use. Most striking were the water channels. Woolley documented a sophisticated system that brought fresh water from ground level to the summit. Not a simple bucket chain, but engineered channels built into the ziggurat structure, allowing water to flow upward through careful management of pressure and gravity. Why would a symbolic temple need running water? But if someone actually used this space, actually lived or stayed there regularly, then water delivery made practical sense. The storage rooms at the summit showed evidence of food provisions. Woolley found remains of grain storage vessels, cooking areas, and spaces that appeared designed for food preparation. Again, this speaks to occupation rather than occasional ritual. Someone needed to eat up there. Someone required regular sustenance, suggesting extended stays rather than brief ceremonial appearances. The chambers showed wear patterns consistent with regular use. Floors were worn smooth from foot traffic. Doorway thresholds showed the kind of erosion that comes from constant passage. Walls bore marks suggesting furniture placement. Hooks for hanging objects, the small architectural details that accumulate when spaces are actually lived in rather than occasionally visited. The texts say the ziggurat was a place for gods to descend, a meeting point between heaven and earth. The Sumerian word for ziggurat translates roughly as, quote, 34 or, quote, 35. Each ziggurat had a specific name. The ziggurat at Uruk was called, quote, 36, meaning, quote, 37. Not symbolic language, but description of function. This was the foundation point, the connection between realms, the place where heaven touched earth. But if gods descended to these summit temples, why would they need water and food delivered? Why would they need storage rooms and living quarters? Unless the descent was physical, unless divine visitation meant actual presence that required actual accommodation. Woolley noted another feature, the approach to the summit. The ziggurat at Uruk had 3 staircases, 2 on the north face and 1 on the south, all meeting at the first level, then a single staircase leading to the summit. The stairs weren't decorative, they were functional, built wide enough for multiple people to walk side by side, their treads sized for comfortable climbing. Someone was meant to go up and down these stairs regularly. The positioning of ziggurats within cities was also deliberate. They weren't centrally located, but placed at the edge of the sacred precinct, in positions that suggested approach from outside the city rather than from within. As if the gods descended from beyond and needed clear access to their landing platform. Other ziggurats showed similar features. At Nippur, the ziggurat of Enlil had comparable water systems and summit facilities. At Uruk, the ziggurat dedicated to Anu showed evidence of regular provisioning and maintenance. The pattern was consistent. These weren't monuments, but functional architecture, maintained at enormous expense to serve regular use. Consider the effort required. Building a ziggurat took years, sometimes generations. Workers quarried clay, shaped millions of bricks, carried them to the construction site, laid them in precise patterns, built drainage systems to prevent water damage, created staircases and passages, finished the summit with the temple complex. Then they had to maintain it constantly. Mud brick erodes quickly in Mesopotamia's harsh climate. Rain dissolves it, heat cracks it. The ziggurats required ongoing repair, constant vigilance, continuous labour just to keep them from dissolving back into the earth. The Sumerians invested this effort for thousands of years. They maintained their ziggurats through war, famine, political upheaval, and environmental catastrophe. These structures were clearly essential, important enough to justify enormous ongoing expense. But important for what? The standard answer that they were symbolic meeting places between heaven and earth doesn't quite account for the physical facilities. Symbols don't need running water, but beings who descend from heaven to spend time in a summit temple, who require food and water and comfortable quarters during their stays, would need exactly the kind of facilities Woolley documented. The ziggurats stand, even now, as evidence of what the Sumerians believed about their gods. These were beings who came from above, who needed accommodation when they descended, who required human labour to maintain their earthly dwelling places, not abstract spirits, but physical presences that demanded physical infrastructure to accommodate their visits to the human world. 400 miles north of Sumer, in the Cappadocia region of Turkey, archaeologists have documented more than 200 underground cities carved from soft volcanic rock. The largest, Derinkuyu, descends 280 feet beneath the earth and could house 20,000 people, along with livestock and food storage. Carbon dating suggests construction began around 8th century BCE, thousands of years after Sumer's rise, but local legends claim the tunnels are far older, predating written history. What makes these cities relevant to the Sumerian question is their design. Not temporary shelters, but permanent underground communities with ventilation systems, wells, schools, and wine cellars. Someone built them to live beneath the earth for extended periods. The official explanation is protection from invasions, but the scale and sophistication suggest the builders feared something that required more than temporary refuge. Derinkuyu, discovered in 1963 when a local resident found a mysterious room behind a wall in his basement, is only the largest of an extensive network of underground cities. The excavated portions descend 18 levels into the earth. Though sealed passages suggest even deeper construction exists, the complexity staggers. This isn't a cave system that was simply expanded. It's an entirely artificial environment, carefully planned and executed, carved from the soft volcanic tuff that makes up the region's bedrock. The ventilation system alone demonstrates sophisticated engineering. Over 50 vertical shafts, some reaching nearly 300 feet deep, provide fresh air to all levels. The shafts were positioned to create natural circulation, drawing fresh air down and pulling stale air up. Without this system, the lower levels would be uninhabitable. Yet the ventilation works so well that even the deepest chambers maintain breathable air. Someone understood airflow dynamics well enough to engineer life support for 20,000 people, living entirely underground. Water came from wells dug deep into aquifers. The wells were positioned strategically throughout the city to ensure every level had access to fresh water, without requiring residents to travel to the surface. The water system included not just wells but distribution channels, storage cisterns, and drainage to prevent flooding. Someone designed a complete underground water infrastructure. The layout reveals permanent habitation rather than emergency shelter. The cities contain stables for livestock, suggesting animals were kept underground for extended periods. There are wine and oil presses indicating production of goods, not just storage. There are churches, though these are likely later additions from Christian communities that used the cities during Roman persecutions. There are communal kitchens, schools, meeting halls, and private chambers for families. Most striking are the rolling stone doors, massive circular stones, some weighing over 1,000 pounds, were carved to roll across passages and seal sections of the city. These doors could only be moved from inside, making each section defensible against intrusion. The doors appear at strategic points throughout the complex, suggesting a defense system that could seal off compromised areas while maintaining the integrity of deeper levels. Someone designed these cities not just for hiding, but for sustained defense against threats that might penetrate the upper levels. The official explanation holds that these cities were carved over centuries as protection against invasions. The region faced repeated attacks from Assyrians, Persians, and later Arab raiders. Underground cities would provide civilian populations safe refuge during conflicts. But this explanation struggles with scale. Derinkuyu alone could house 20,000 people. The region contains over 200 similar structures. Combined, they could shelter hundreds of thousands. What invasion would drive populations to live entirely underground for the months or years required to justify such elaborate permanent infrastructure? Local legends passed down through generations before modern archaeology documented the sites, tell different stories. They speak of people hiding from beings that came from the sky. They describe a time when the surface world became dangerous, when something from above threatened humanity, when entire populations withdrew underground to survive. Modern scholars dismiss these as folklore, imaginative explanations for structures whose true origin was forgotten. But the legends are consistent across the region, suggesting they preserve genuine memory of why the cities were built. The connection to Sumerian underground construction is speculative. Cappadocia is 400 miles from Sumer. The documented construction dates are thousands of years apart. Different cultures, different contexts, different purposes, yet the similarities are striking. Both involve extraordinary effort to create permanent underground habitation. Both show sophisticated engineering that speaks to serious, sustained threat rather than simple convenience. Both suggest their builders believed the surface world could become unsafe enough to justify abandoning it entirely. The timeline is also interesting. Carbon dating suggests Derinkuyu's construction began around 8th century BCE, but the deepest levels resist accurate dating. The soft tuff doesn't preserve organic material well, and the constant occupation and modification over millennia has confused the archaeological record. Local legends insisting the cities are far older than established dates might not be entirely wrong. The visible construction might be expansion and renovation of much earlier foundations. And here's another detail. The cities weren't secret. They weren't lost or forgotten until 1963. Local populations knew about them, used them, maintained them for thousands of years. Yet their original purpose was obscure even to those who lived above them. The people who carved Derinkuyu left no written records explaining why. They simply built, descended, and survived whatever threatened them. Then later generations, no longer facing the original threat, continued using the cities for protection against more conventional dangers, gradually forgetting what had first driven their ancestors to undertake such extraordinary construction. The Epic of Gilgamesh, literature's oldest surviving story, contains a troubling detail often overlooked in discussions of its literary merit. When Gilgamesh and Enkidu kill Humbaba, guardian of the cedar forest, and then slay the bull of heaven sent by Ishtar, the gods gather in council to decide punishment. They choose Enkidu to die, and the text describes his death in clinical detail, a wasting illness that takes 12 days, during which Enkidu dreams of the underworld and understands exactly why the gods have condemned him. There's no vagueness here, no room for symbolic interpretation. The gods directly caused his death as punishment for defying their will. Later, when the gods decide to flood the earth, again it's not natural disaster but deliberate genocide. The question the epic raises is unavoidable. If the gods could kill at will, what could humans do except hide? The Epic of Gilgamesh survives in multiple versions, from fragmentary Sumerian poems to the complete standard Babylonian version, recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. Across all versions, one theme remains constant. The gods have power over life and death. And they exercise that power personally, deliberately, with immediate effect. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, is 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, powerful enough to oppress his city with his strength and arrogance. The people cry out to the gods for relief. The gods respond by creating Enkidu, a wild man who becomes Gilgamesh's friend and equal, channeling his energy toward adventure rather than oppression. Together, they decide to journey to the cedar forest and kill its guardian, Humbaba, to win glory and cut down cedars for building. Humbaba is terrifying. The text describes his roar like a flood, his breath like fire, his jaws like death. He was placed in the forest by Enlil specifically to terrify humans, to guard the cedars from mortal hands. When Gilgamesh and Enkidu track him down, Humbaba begs for his life, offering to serve Gilgamesh if spared. But Enkidu, knowing the gods will be angry if Humbaba is released, urges Gilgamesh to kill him. They do, cutting off his head and taking it back to Uruk as trophy. The gods are indeed angry. Enlil is furious that his appointed guardian was killed. But before the gods can respond, Ishtar compounds the problem. She desires Gilgamesh and offers him marriage. He rejects her brutally, reciting a list of her previous lovers and how she destroyed each one. Ishtar, enraged, goes to her father Anu and demands he send the bull of heaven to destroy Uruk. The bull descends. The text describes it specifically. With its first snort, it creates a pit that swallows 100 men. With its second snort, another 100 die. With its third, 300. Enkidu manages to grab its tail while Gilgamesh kills it with his sword. They've now killed two beings the gods created and placed as guardians. They've defied Ishtar directly. The Divine Council gathers to decide response. The gods debate. Someone must die for these offences. But who? Gilgamesh is 2/3 divine, son of the goddess Ninsun. Killing him would be complicated. Enkidu, however, is entirely created, made by Aruru from clay specifically to serve a purpose. The gods choose Enkidu. What follows is one of literature's most moving passages. Enkidu falls ill. For 12 days he lies dying, fever consuming him, strength draining away. He dreams of the underworld, sees the house of dust where the dead dwell in darkness, eating clay and drinking dirt. He understands his death is divine punishment, that the gods have decreed his fate, and there's no escape or reprieve. He rages against his fate, curses the hunter who first civilized him, curses the temple prostitute who brought him to Uruk. But gradually he accepts. On the 12th day, he dies, and Gilgamesh weeps over his friend's body, refusing to believe someone so vital can simply cease to exist. The text doesn't frame this as natural death or illness. It's explicit. The gods decided Enkidu should die, and therefore he died. They inflicted illness as punishment, controlled the timing and manner of his death, executed their will upon his body directly. Enkidu understands this. He knows exactly why he's dying, knows which gods made the decision, knows his death is deliberate divine action. This understanding drives the rest of the epic. Gilgamesh, confronted with mortality through his friend's death, becomes terrified of his own eventual demise. He embarks on a quest for immortality, seeking Utnapishtim, the Sumerian Noah who survived the flood and was granted eternal life. When Gilgamesh finally finds him, Utnapishtim tells the flood story. Describes how the gods decided to destroy humanity completely. The flood narrative in Gilgamesh parallels the earlier Atrahasis epic, but adds details that emphasize divine deliberation. Enlil makes the decision. The other gods swear to keep it secret from humanity. Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki, breaks the oath by speaking to the reed wall of Utnapishtim's house, warning him indirectly. Utnapishtim builds the boat, loads it, and survives, while the flood destroys everything else. The text describes the gods' reaction to their own destruction. They cower like dogs. They weep like women in childbirth. They seem horrified by what Enlil has unleashed. When the flood ends, and Utnapishtim emerges to make offerings, the gods gather around the sacrifice quote, _38 desperate for food because apparently they hadn't eaten during the flood. Enlil arrives furious that anyone survived, demanding to know who broke the oath. The gods defend Ea's intervention, arguing that destroying all humanity was excessive. The story reveals divine vulnerability. The gods need human offerings for sustenance. They can make decisions that horrify even themselves. Their power is immense but not absolute, and most relevant to our question, they can decide to destroy humanity, can execute that decision with terrifying efficiency, and only internal divine politics prevented complete extinction. If this is what Gilgamesh teaches, if the oldest story in literature is about gods who kill personally and deliberately, who can decide to end human civilization and very nearly did, then human architecture that includes underground refugees makes disturbing sense. The question Gilgamesh raises isn't whether the gods exist or whether they're powerful. The question is, given that they exist and can kill at will, how do humans survive when divine will turns against them? The answer, both in the flood narrative and in the archaeological evidence beneath Sumerian cities, seems to be hide, go underground, withdraw from sight, create spaces where divine attention might not penetrate. Because if the gods decide you should die, you have perhaps one chance, that one god might secretly warn you, might tell you how to survive, might give you time to build a boat or descend into the earth before heaven's anger falls. Among the myths recovered from Sumerian sites, several describe a time when the Anunnaki withdrew from daily contact with humanity. The texts frame this as a change in divine will, a decision by the gods to distance themselves from the affairs of humans. But reading these passages alongside archaeological evidence raises questions. The texts say the gods returned to heaven or went back to their place, leaving humanity to govern itself under the kingship system they had established. This supposed withdrawal coincides, roughly, with a decline in the elaborate underground construction beneath Sumerian temples. After around 2000 BCE, new temples still had subterranean elements, but not the extensive chamber systems found in earlier periods. Either the need for such spaces ended, or the knowledge of why they had been necessary was forgotten. The transition appears in multiple texts from different periods, suggesting it represents genuine cultural memory rather than isolated myth. The texts don't describe a sudden departure but a gradual withdrawal, a slow distancing between divine and human realms. Earlier texts show the Anunnaki actively involved in daily human affairs, settling disputes, choosing kings, appearing in temples, demanding specific offerings. Later texts describe the gods as more remote, their will interpreted through omens and priests rather than direct communication. One text from the late 3rd millennium BCE speaks of a time quote, 41. The phrasing suggests not abandonment but delegation, as if the Anunnaki had completed some initial phase of involvement and were now allowing humans to operate independently under the systems they had established. Kingship would continue, but kings would no longer meet gods face to face. Temples would remain, but as houses maintained for occasional divine visits rather than permanent residences. The archaeological timeline supports this textual evidence of change. The most elaborate underground construction beneath Sumerian temples dates to the early dynastic period, roughly 3200 to 2300 BCE. During this period, the chambers beneath places like Eridu, Ur, and Nippur show evidence of regular use, constant maintenance, and ongoing expansion. But after around 2000 BCE, new temple construction shows different patterns. Subterranean elements become simpler, more clearly oriented towards storage and foundation work rather than habitation. At Ur, Leonard Woolley noted that the earliest levels beneath the ziggurat showed the most sophisticated underground architecture, while later rebuilding phases didn't replicate this complexity. The elaborate vaulted chambers, the sealed passages, the evidence of long-term occupation all belong to the earlier periods. Later construction used the earlier chambers as foundation, but didn't create new ones of comparable scale or sophistication. The same pattern appears at Eridu. The deepest, most complex chambers beneath Enki's temple date to the city's earliest periods. Later temple rebuilding, right up until the city's abandonment around 2500 BCE, built upward but not downward, raising the temple platform higher without creating new underground infrastructure to match. This decline in underground construction coincides with textual descriptions of divine withdrawal. As the gods supposedly retreated to heaven, the need to maintain elaborate underground spaces diminished. Either the threat that necessitated such refugees had passed, or the relationship between gods and humans had changed in ways that made hiding unnecessary. But there's another possibility, darker and more troubling. Perhaps the withdrawal wasn't voluntary divine choice but forced separation. Perhaps something changed that made the close contact of earlier periods impossible or dangerous. The texts describe the gods returning to heaven, with language that sometimes suggests reluctance, as if they were leaving something behind they valued. And if the Anunnaki had genuinely departed, if they were no longer present in ways that required physical accommodation, then perhaps humans no longer needed underground refuges because there was nothing left to hide from. The transition also coincides with changes in Sumerian political structure. The early dynastic period was characterized by multiple independent city-states, each with its patron deity and ruling dynasty. But around 2300 BCE, Sargon of Akkad conquered most of Mesopotamia, creating the First Empire. This political centralization paralleled religious centralization, with power concentrating in fewer cities and temples. The intensely local worship of earlier periods, where each city maintained elaborate facilities for its patron deity, gave way to more standardized religious practice across the empire. Whether divine withdrawal caused political centralization, or political changes altered how people understood and practiced religion, or both developments reflected some deeper cultural transformation, the result was clear. The Mesopotamia of 2000 BCE operated differently from the Mesopotamia of 3000 BCE. The gods seemed more distant. The temples functioned more as symbolic centers than active residences. And the underground chambers that had been so carefully maintained gradually filled with debris and faded from memory, their purpose obscure even to later inhabitants of the same cities. Some texts suggest the withdrawal was specifically a response to the flood. After the catastrophe that nearly destroyed humanity, the gods supposedly decided to maintain more distance, to exercise power through intermediaries rather than direct presence. This would make sense if the flood had been traumatic for both humans and gods, if the near extinction had taught everyone involved that the relationship between divine and human required new boundaries. But whatever caused the withdrawal, its effects shaped the rest of Mesopotamian history. The intimate, immediate divine presence of early Sumer gradually became the more abstract, distant divinity of Babylonian religion, which in turn influenced how later cultures understood the relationship between gods and humans. The underground chambers remained, sealed and forgotten, evidence of a time when humans had built as if they might need to hide from the very gods they worshipped. The story of Adapa, preserved on tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal but originating in much earlier Sumerian tradition, tells of a wise man created by Enki who was offered immortality by Wanu but refused it through trickery. The text describes Adapa being summoned to heaven to answer for breaking the wing of the south wind, a deed that disrupted the natural order. When Anu offers him the bread and water of life, Enki has warned Adapa not to eat or drink anything in heaven, so he refuses and loses his chance at immortality. The story is usually read as explaining human mortality, but it also describes heaven as a physical place Adapa visits, where gods eat physical food and where a human can be summoned to face judgment. The text treats this journey not as vision or dream, but as actual travel to another realm. Adapa was, according to the text, a priest of Enki in the ancient city of Eridu. Enki had created him with great wisdom, giving him understanding of everything necessary for civilization, but withholding immortality. Adapa served Enki faithfully, managing the temple, performing rituals, and going out daily to fish in the waters that surrounded Eridu. One day while fishing, the south wind rose and capsized his boat, throwing Adapa into the water. In anger, Adapa spoke a curse, and the power of his words, enhanced by the wisdom Enki had given him, actually broke the south wind's wing. For 7 days no south wind blew across the land, disrupting the natural order and causing problems for both gods and humans. Anu, observing from heaven, noticed the disruption and demanded to know what had happened. When informed that Adapa had broken the south wind's wing, Anu summoned him to heaven to answer for this offence. The text describes this summons matter-of-factly, Using the same administrative language employed for earthly court appearances, Adapa was called. He had to respond. There was apparently a mechanism by which a human could physically travel to the divine realm. Before Adapa departed, Enki gave him specific instructions. "Dress in mourning when you arrive," Enki advised, "because Tammuz and Gazida, two gods who had died and been resurrected, will be standing at heaven's gate. They will ask why you mourn, and you should say you mourn for them, for the two gods who disappeared from earth. This will please them, and they will speak favourably about you to Anu. But most importantly," Enki warned, "when you are brought before Anu, he will offer you bread and water. Do not eat or drink. The bread will be the bread of death. The water will be the water of death. If you consume them, you will die." Adapa followed these instructions precisely. He dressed in mourning, travelled to heaven through means the text doesn't specify, and arrived at the gate where Tammuz and Gazida stood guard. They asked about his mourning clothes. He explained he mourned for them, for the gods who had left Earth. Pleased, they spoke well of him to Anu. When Adapa came before Anu, the Sky Father questioned him about the south wind. Adapa explained what had happened, how the wind had capsized his boat, and how his anger had resulted in the curse that broke its wing. Anu, impressed by Adapa's honesty and influenced by Tammuz and Gazida's favourable words, decided to offer him a gift. He brought out bread and water, not of death as Enki had warned, but of life, immortality itself. But Adapa, following Enki's instructions, refused. He would not eat the bread. He would not drink the water. Anu, confused, asked why. When Adapa explained that Enki had warned him these were bread and water of death, Anu realized what had happened. Enki had tricked his own creation, preventing Adapa from accepting the gift of eternal life. Anu sent Adapa back to Earth, mortal as before, and humanity, descended from Adapa, inherited his mortality. Forever barred from the immortality the Sky Father had been willing to grant. The story troubles scholars because of how it portrays divine relationships. Enki supposedly loved his creation, yet he deliberately denied Adapa immortality through deception. Why? The text doesn't fully explain. Some interpret it as Enki maintaining cosmic order, ensuring humans remain mortal as the gods intended. Others see it as political manoeuvring, Enki preventing Anu from creating a human rival to divine authority. But what makes the story archaeologically relevant is its treatment of heaven as physical place. Adapa doesn't have a vision. He doesn't dream of heaven. He travels there, stands at its gate, meets guardians, enters Anu's presence, and is offered actual food and drink. The text describes this journey using the same concrete language it uses for earthly travel. Heaven, in this narrative, is a location you can go to, not a spiritual state or metaphorical realm. The gods who dwell there eat and drink. They have gates requiring guards. They conduct business, hold audiences, and make judgments in ways that parallel earthly courts. Anu offers bread and water that grant immortality, suggesting these are actual substances with physical effects, not symbolic gestures. If this was how Sumerians understood heaven, if it was a real place where gods resided physically, where humans could potentially travel and interact with divine beings, then the entire cosmology becomes more concrete than modern religious frameworks assume. The Anunnaki weren't invisible spirits dwelling in abstract spiritual dimensions. They were powerful beings residing in a specific place called heaven, from which they could descend to earth and to which they could summon humans for judgment. And if heaven was physical, if the gods were physical, if the interaction between realms was actual rather than symbolic, then Sumerian architecture makes different sense. The ziggurats weren't reaching toward metaphorical transcendence, but toward an actual place above. The underground chambers weren't symbolic depths, but practical refuges from beings whose power was real, immediate, and potentially threatening. Throughout Mesopotamia, archaeologists have documented sudden abandonments of cities that can't be fully explained by war, drought, or disease. Uruk, the greatest Sumerian city, saw dramatic population decline around 2000 BCE. Eridu, the oldest city, was mysteriously abandoned around 2500 BCE despite showing no signs of conquest or disaster. When excavators examined these abandoned sites, they found something peculiar. The underground chambers and tunnel systems beneath the temple complexes had been deliberately sealed, filled with rubble, as if closing something off forever. Personal possessions were left behind. No signs of looting or panic, just systematic closure and departure. Whatever caused these abandonments, the people took time to carefully seal the spaces beneath the earth before they left. Eridu's abandonment is particularly mysterious because the city held such cultural significance. This was, according to Sumerian tradition, the first city where kingship first descended from heaven, where Enki established his temple in the Abzu. For thousands of years, Eridu had been continuously occupied, its temple rebuilt 18 times in the same sacred location. Then, around 2500 BCE, the population simply left. Seton Lloyd, excavating Eridu in the 1940s, found no evidence of violent destruction. The wall stood intact. No ash layers suggested burning. No mass graves indicated plague or massacre. The city just emptied, its inhabitants departing over what appears to have been a relatively short period, taking their portable valuables, but leaving behind pottery, tools, and household items that suggest sudden rather than gradual abandonment. Most puzzling was what Lloyd found in the underground chambers beneath Enki's temple. These elaborate spaces, which had shown evidence of regular use and careful maintenance for thousands of years, had been deliberately filled. Not collapsed through neglect, not damaged by disaster, systematically packed with rubble, sand, and debris, as if someone had taken considerable time and effort to seal them permanently. The filling was thorough, passages were blocked, chambers were packed solid, ventilation shafts were capped. Whoever did this work wanted to ensure these spaces would never be used again, would remain inaccessible even if someone later wanted to reopen them. The effort required would have been substantial, perhaps taking weeks or months, involving significant labour during what was apparently the final period of the city's occupation. Why seal the chambers? If the city was being abandoned for economic or environmental reasons, why not simply leave them open? If enemy invasion threatened, why take time for elaborate sealing work instead of fleeing? The deliberate closure suggests the spaces themselves were significant, that whatever they represented or contained needed to be permanently closed off before the population could safely depart. Uruk shows a similar pattern. The greatest city of early Sumer, home to Gilgamesh, centre of Inanna's cult, Uruk thrived for thousands of years before experiencing dramatic population decline around 2000 BCE. The city didn't die completely, it continued as a smaller settlement for centuries, but the massive population that had sustained it as Mesopotamia's largest urban centre dispersed over a relatively brief period. Archaeological surveys of Uruk reveal the same phenomenon Lloyd found at Eridu. The underground passages beneath the great temple complexes were deliberately sealed during this transition period. Workers filled them with rubble, blocked access points, and ensured they couldn't easily be reopened. Personal items were left in houses. Workshops show signs of being abandoned mid-operation. But the underground spaces received special attention, careful closure that required deliberate effort. Other Sumerian cities show variations of this pattern. Nippur experienced population decline, though it remained occupied as a religious centre. Lagash was abandoned and resettled multiple times. Shuruppak, one of the 5 cities the Eridu Genesis names as antediluvian, was abandoned around 2000 BCE and never reoccupied. In each case where archaeologists have excavated temple complexes, they find evidence of underground spaces being sealed, closed off, made inaccessible through intentional human action, rather than natural collapse or gradual neglect. The timing is significant. These abandonments cluster around 2000 BCE, coinciding with the end of the Uruk III period and beginning of the Old Babylonian period. This was a time of political upheaval, climate change, and cultural transformation. The Sumerian language was dying, replaced by Akkadian. The old city-state system was giving way to territorial kingdoms. Traditional power structures were collapsing. But political and environmental factors don't fully explain the careful sealing of underground spaces. If cities were abandoned due to drought or invasion, the underground chambers would simply be left empty, not deliberately filled and sealed. The systematic closure suggests these spaces held significance beyond simple architecture, that leaving them open was somehow problematic or dangerous, that whatever they represented needed to be permanently closed before the population could move on. Were they sealing away knowledge? Hiding evidence of practices later generations would find troubling? Ensuring that whatever had once occurred in those depths couldn't happen again? Or were they closing doors, sealing passages that had once allowed movement between realms, making certain that what had once descended through those depths could no longer find its way up? These sealed chambers remain throughout Iraq, buried beneath tells that subsequent civilizations built upon, their contents and purpose obscured by 4,000 years and the rubble that fills them. Modern excavation has opened some but left most untouched, partly because the effort required to clear them is substantial, partly because the sites are often in areas too unstable for extensive archaeological work. But the pattern is clear. When Sumer's great cities emptied, when the populations that had sustained civilization for over 1,000 years dispersed, they took time to seal the underground spaces their ancestors had built with such care. Whatever those chambers meant, whatever purpose they had served, that purpose ended when the cities emptied, and the people who left made certain it would remain ended, that future generations wouldn't reopen what they so deliberately closed. Sumerian cylinder seals, small stone cylinders carved with scenes that could be rolled across wet clay to create impressions, provide some of the most direct visual evidence of how Sumerians understood the Anunnaki. Thousands of these seals survive, many showing what appear to be gatherings between gods and humans. But certain seals show scenes that don't fit comfortable interpretations. Beings who are clearly larger than the humans around them, wearing what look like wrist cuffs or bracelets and unusual headgear, sometimes holding tools or weapons that defy clear identification. One famous seal, VA-243 in the Berlin Museum, shows a figure gesturing toward a star pattern some researchers have controversially interpreted as our solar system. Whether that interpretation is correct matters less than the clear intent of these seals. They were meant to record actual interactions, not abstract theology. Cylinder seals were ubiquitous in Sumerian society. Every person of any status owned one, using it as signature, identification, and protection. Rolling a seal across wet clay created a unique impression that authenticated documents, sealed containers, and marked personal property. The images carved into these seals range from simple geometric patterns to complex narrative scenes, but they all shared one characteristic. They were meant to be clear, recognizable, and unambiguous. This wasn't abstract art. These were practical tools requiring functional imagery. When a seal depicted a deity, the image had to be recognizable enough that anyone seeing the impression could identify which god was represented. When a seal showed a transaction or ritual, the scene had to communicate clearly what was happening. The carvers created visual shorthand that functioned like written language, conveying specific information through standardized imagery. Given this functional nature, the scenes on many seals are troubling because they resist comfortable symbolic interpretation. They appear to depict events, interactions, or beings that don't align with how modern scholarship understands Sumerian religion. Not mythology, not allegory. Events. Many seals show figures of obviously different scales. A large figure, clearly meant to be understood as deity, towers over smaller human figures. This could be simple artistic convention, making divine beings larger to indicate status. But the consistency and precision of the scale relationship suggest the carvers meant something more literal. The gods aren't just symbolically greater. They're actually larger, physically imposing in ways that require humans to look up at them. The figures identified as gods often wear distinctive items that appear across multiple seals, wrist cuffs or bracelets that seem too elaborate to be simple jewellery, headgear that doesn't match known crown or helmet designs. Sometimes objects they hold that might be tools or weapons but don't clearly correspond to anything in the known Sumerian material culture. What were these items? If the seals are recording actual interactions, documenting things the carvers had seen or heard described, then these mysterious objects represent real artifacts whose purpose is now lost. The seal designated VA-243, housed in Berlin's Vorderasiatisches Museum, has generated particular controversy. It shows what appears to be a presentation scene, a seated figure receiving a standing figure with attendants present. But in the upper left portion of the seal there's a star pattern consisting of one large central dot surrounded by smaller dots. Zechariah Sitchin, in his controversial work on ancient astronaut theories, claimed this represented our solar system, with the central sun and surrounding planets, including a supposed 10th planet the Sumerians knew about. Mainstream scholars have thoroughly debunked this interpretation. The pattern is more likely decorative or represents a specific star or constellation important in Sumerian astronomy. The number and arrangement of dots doesn't accurately match our solar system. And reading advanced astronomical knowledge into what's probably simple stellar symbolism requires ignoring both context and scholarly consensus. But setting aside Sitchin's specific claims, the seal still raises interesting questions. Why include celestial imagery at all? What was the carver intending to communicate by placing stars or planets in a scene depicting divine human interaction? The combination suggests some connection between the divine figures and the heavens, which aligns with textual descriptions of the Anunnaki descending from heaven, but doesn't tell us what the Sumerians actually believed about that connection. Other seals show winged figures, often interpreted as lesser deities or protective spirits. But the wings are depicted with such careful detail, showing individual feathers and structural mechanics, that they seem meant to represent actual functional wings rather than symbolic attributes. If these images record what Sumerians believed they were seeing, then some divine or semi-divine beings had wings that actually worked, that allowed flight. Some seals depict what appear to be technological objects, cylindrical devices held by divine figures, structures that might be buildings but have unusual features suggesting non-standard architecture, objects that scholars label as quote 43 because their actual function isn't clear. If we assume the carvers were depicting things they knew about, things that existed in their world, then Sumerian material culture included objects whose purpose we can't determine from the archaeological record. The seals showing conflict scenes are particularly detailed. When they depict the bull of heaven being slain by Gilgamesh and Enkidu, the creature is rendered with precision, suggesting the carver had a clear mental image of what it looked like. When they show divine weapons or implements, these objects appear consistent across multiple seals, suggesting they represent actual things with specific, recognizable forms. What the cylinder seals ultimately reveal is that Sumerians had a visual vocabulary for depicting their gods and divine interactions. They created standardized imagery that communicated specific information about divine appearance, behavior, and implements. Whether these images depicted actual beings and objects, or whether they were conventional representations of religious concepts, they were meant to be clear, unambiguous, and recognizable. And many of them show things that don't easily fit into purely symbolic or mythological interpretation. What troubles archaeologists about Sumerian civilization isn't just its sudden appearance around 3200 BCE, but the precision of its knowledge from the very beginning. The Sumerians had sophisticated mathematics. including understanding of the Pythagorean theorem over 1,000 years before Pythagoras. They used a base 60 number system we still employ for measuring time and angles. Their astronomical observations were accurate enough that modern calculations can verify their recorded planetary positions. They had detailed medical texts describing surgeries and treatments that wouldn't be rediscovered until modern times. All of this appeared not at the end of a long development process, but at the beginning, as if someone had taught them, exactly as their own texts claim Enki and the Anunnaki had done. The mathematical knowledge encoded in Sumerian tablets astonishes modern scholars. Tablet YBC 7646, a clay tablet from the old Babylonian period now housed at Yale, contains a list of Pythagorean triples, sets of 3 numbers that satisfy the equation a squared plus b squared equals c squared. This tablet predates Pythagoras by over 1,000 years. The Sumerians knew the mathematical relationship we name after a Greek philosopher, and they knew it well enough to calculate and tabulate examples. But how did they discover this? Mathematical theorems typically emerge from long traditions of investigation, building on earlier work, gradually refining understanding through generations of mathematicians. Yet Sumerian mathematics appears suddenly in the archaeological record, already sophisticated, already capable of complex calculations that should require extensive prior development. Their base 60 number system demonstrates similar inexplicable sophistication. We still use it for measuring time, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. We use it for measuring angles, 360 degrees in a circle, 6 times 60. The Sumerians developed this system around 5,000 years ago, and it was so well designed that humanity has never found reason to replace it for these applications. But why base 60? It's not intuitive. Human hands have 10 fingers, suggesting base 10 would be more natural. Many early cultures used base 10 or base 20. Base 60 is complicated, requiring memorization of many more number symbols and multiplication facts. Yet it has enormous mathematical advantages. 60 is divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, making fractional calculations much easier than base 10 allows. Someone had to recognize these advantages and deliberately design a number system to exploit them. This requires sophisticated mathematical understanding, the kind that should develop only after extensive work with simpler number systems. Yet base 60 appears at the beginning of Sumerian mathematics, suggesting it was designed rather than evolved. Created by someone who understood mathematics well enough to engineer an optimized number system. The astronomical knowledge is equally problematic. Sumerian tablets record observations of Venus's movements with such accuracy that modern astronomers can use them to date historical events. They track the lunar cycle precisely, understanding its variations and calculating eclipse possibilities. They identified all 5 visible planets and distinguished them from stars based on their movement against the fixed stellar background. This level of astronomical knowledge requires sustained, systematic observation over many generations, yet it appears in Sumerian records from the very beginning of their civilization. Either they inherited this knowledge from an earlier unknown culture, or they developed centuries of astronomical observation before inventing writing to record it, or someone taught them, providing astronomical knowledge that became foundational to their culture. The medical texts are perhaps most astonishing. Sumerian tablets describe surgical procedures, pharmaceutical preparations, and diagnostic techniques that demonstrate genuine medical knowledge. They understood infection and prescribed treatments to prevent it. They performed eye surgery, describing the procedure in enough detail that modern physicians can recognize the techniques. They created pharmacological texts listing hundreds of plant-based medicines and their applications. Modern medicine required centuries of scientific investigation to develop these capabilities. Surgical technique emerged from long traditions of anatomical study. Pharmacology developed through systematic investigation of plant properties and effects. Yet Sumerian medical texts present this knowledge as already established, describing procedures and treatments with the confidence of long practice. And then there's their engineering. The irrigation systems they built transformed Mesopotamia from marsh and desert into productive farmland. These weren't simple ditches but complex water management networks requiring understanding of surveying, hydraulic engineering, and regional hydrology. The canals had to maintain precise grades to ensure proper flow. The distribution systems had to balance water delivery across large areas. The drainage had to prevent salinization while removing excess water. This is sophisticated civil engineering, yet the Sumerians implemented it at the very beginning of their urban development. Their architecture demonstrates similar advanced knowledge. The vaulted chambers beneath their temples required understanding of structural engineering that should take generations to develop. The ziggurats, with their massive scale and complex construction, represent achievement that should come late in architectural evolution, not early. Every aspect of Sumerian civilization shows the same pattern: advanced knowledge appearing at the beginning rather than developing gradually. This violates everything archaeology understands about cultural development. Technologies are supposed to improve over time. Knowledge is supposed to accumulate through generations. Sophistication is supposed to emerge from simpler precedents. But Sumer doesn't follow this pattern. Sumer appears suddenly, already sophisticated, already possessing knowledge that should require centuries to develop. And the Sumerians themselves, in their own texts, explain this by saying the Anunnaki taught them. Enki gave them knowledge. The 7 sages emerged from the sea and instructed them in civilization's arts. Kingship descended from heaven, bringing with it the knowledge necessary for organized society. Modern scholarship generally dismisses these explanations as mythological, as ancient people creating stories to explain their own cultural development. But the archaeological evidence of sudden, simultaneous advancement in multiple, sophisticated knowledge domains remains. Something caused Sumerian civilization to appear fully formed. Something provided them with mathematical, astronomical, medical, and engineering knowledge that typically requires extensive prior development. Whether that something was cultural inheritance from an earlier civilization, or rapid indigenous development, or something else, the precision and sophistication of early Sumerian knowledge continues to puzzle archaeologists more than a century after the first tablets were translated. Setting aside speculation, what can archaeology definitively say about Sumerian underground construction? Every major temple complex excavated shows subterranean elements. At Eridu, the Temple of Enki had multiple levels descending to the water table. At Ur, extensive vaulted chambers existed beneath the ziggurat. At Nippur, the temple complex of Enlil showed evidence of underground storage and ritual spaces. These weren't unusual, they were standard architecture. The official explanation is practical: cool storage in the desert heat, protection of sacred objects, ritual purity associated with depth. But the scale often exceeds practical need. The chambers are too large, too carefully constructed, too deliberately placed beneath the most sacred spaces. They suggest architecture built to serve a purpose beyond storage or ritual, even if that purpose is now lost. The archaeological record is clear on certain facts. Subterranean construction was not exceptional in Sumerian architecture, but standard, expected, integral to temple design. When excavators uncover a major temple complex anywhere in ancient Sumer, they expect to find underground elements. They're disappointed when they don't. The pattern is so consistent that its absence would require explanation, not its presence. At Eridu, British archaeologist Seton Lloyd documented chambers descending over 30 feet beneath the temple platform, cut through layers of occupation debris and virgin soil to reach the freshwater spring below. The construction wasn't crude excavation but careful engineering. The walls were brick-lined to prevent collapse. The passages were vaulted to distribute weight. The deepest chambers, Those touching the water table showed evidence of waterproofing techniques using bitumen and carefully selected clay. The effort required to build and maintain such deep construction was substantial. Water constantly seeps into chambers cut below the water table. The chambers at Eridu would have required continuous maintenance, regular drainage, constant attention to prevent flooding and collapse. Yet this effort was sustained for thousands of years. From the earliest temple construction around 5500 BCE through the city's abandonment around 2500 BCE, 3,000 years of maintaining chambers that required constant work to remain usable. For what purpose? Storage doesn't require chambers below the water table. Ritual spaces could be constructed above ground or in shallower depths. The official explanations feel inadequate when confronted with the scale and sophistication of what the Sumerians actually built. At Leonard Woolley mapped an extensive network of vaulted chambers beneath the ziggurat, some predating the massive structure above them, others contemporary with its construction. The engineering impressed him. These weren't simple dugouts, but precisely constructed spaces with carefully calculated vault dimensions, proper load distribution, and attention to long-term structural stability. The builders understood they were creating foundations for enormous weight above, and they built accordingly. But again, the scale exceeds structural necessity. Some chambers served no obvious load-bearing function. They were simply spaces beneath the earth, carefully constructed, maintained over centuries, showing evidence of use but not of any specific activity that would explain their existence. Empty rooms in the deep, waiting beneath temples, maintained at great expense for purposes the archaeological record doesn't clearly reveal. At Nippur, the temple complex of Enlil showed similar patterns: underground chambers, passage systems, spaces that seemed to serve functions beyond simple storage or foundation work. The excavators documented them, measured them, catalogued their features, and moved on to more interpretable finds, leaving the question of purpose largely unanswered. The practice wasn't limited to the largest cities. Smaller Sumerian settlements, when excavated, show similar architectural emphasis on underground construction beneath sacred spaces. The pattern scales with city size but maintains consistent principles. Temples built upward and downward simultaneously, creating architecture that acknowledges both heaven and earth, both height and depth. What the archaeology definitively establishes is consistency, sophistication, and sustained effort over thousands of years. The Sumerians invested enormous resources in underground construction. They developed specialized techniques for building below the water table. They maintained these spaces constantly, preventing collapse and flooding through continuous labor. And they did this as standard practice, not exceptional architecture, but expected elements of sacred construction. The texts don't provide clear explanations either. References to the Abzu, to depths beneath the earth, to spaces where Enki dwelled suggest religious significance. But the texts don't describe practical uses. They don't explain why chambers needed to be so large, so deep, so carefully maintained. The religious explanations acknowledge the space's existence but don't clarify their function. Modern archaeology finds itself in the uncomfortable position of having clear evidence of what the Sumerians built but limited understanding of why. The chambers exist, the effort is documented, the maintenance is evident, but the purpose remains obscure, hidden behind 4,000 years of changed context, lost knowledge, and vanished cultural frameworks that would make the obvious visible. Perhaps future excavations will reveal clearer evidence of function. Perhaps undiscovered texts will explain what the chambers were for. Or perhaps the answer lies in taking the Sumerians' own religious framework more seriously, in understanding that their architecture expressed their beliefs not symbolically but literally, building spaces to accommodate a cosmology they understood as physical reality rather than spiritual metaphor. Beginning in the 1970s, writers like Zecharia Sitchin proposed that the Anunnaki were actually extraterrestrial beings, that their _quote, _44, described literal space travel, and that much of Sumerian mythology recorded actual historical contact with advanced non-human entities. Mainstream archaeology has thoroughly rejected these interpretations, pointing out mistranslations, selective use of evidence, and unsupported leaps of logic in Sitchin's work. But the controversy obscures a more interesting question. Setting aside the extraterrestrial hypothesis, what if we take Sumerian texts seriously as historical records? Not literally, not uncritically, but seriously. What if the Anunnaki were real to the Sumerians not as metaphors, but as actual beings they dealt with? What would that mean for understanding the relationship between their theology and their architecture? Zecharia Sitchin's books, beginning with quote 45 in 1976, proposed a radical reinterpretation of Sumerian mythology. He argued that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial visitors from a hypothetical planet called Nibiru, that they came to Earth to mine gold, that they genetically engineered humans as a slave species, and that much of human civilization resulted from this alien intervention. His work became enormously popular, selling millions of copies and spawning countless imitators and elaborations. Mainstream scholars have systematically dismantled Sitchin's arguments. His translations of Sumerian were often incorrect. He cherry-picked evidence while ignoring contradictory data. He made astronomical claims that violate known physics. He proposed genetic engineering before DNA was understood in ways that don't align with how genetics actually works. His entire framework rests on mistranslations, misunderstandings, and speculation unsupported by evidence. Michael Heiser, a scholar of ancient Near Eastern languages, wrote extensive critiques demonstrating that Sitchin couldn't actually read Sumerian, that his translations contradicted established scholarship without justification, and that his theories required ignoring most of what the texts actually say. Other Assyriologists have pointed out similar problems, and Sitchin's work is not taken seriously in academic archaeology or ancient language studies. So that's settled. Sitchin was wrong. The extraterrestrial hypothesis doesn't hold up to scrutiny. The Anunnaki were not aliens from another planet. But here's what gets lost in debunking Sitchin: the question of how to understand what the Sumerians actually believed. Modern scholarship tends to treat ancient religion as purely symbolic, as metaphorical frameworks for understanding natural forces and social structures. When Sumerians said the Anunnaki descended from heaven, we interpret this as mythological explanation for where religious authority comes from. When they described gods walking among humans, we understand this as personification of abstract divine forces. This interpretive framework is comfortable for modern scholars because it doesn't require taking ancient beliefs literally. We can study Sumerian religion as a cultural phenomenon without confronting the troubling implications of what it might mean if the Sumerians actually believed, in concrete rather than symbolic terms, that powerful beings called Anunnaki existed and interacted with humanity. But what if the Sumerians meant what they said? Not in the sense Sitchin proposed. Not as literal space aliens, but as beings they understood as real, physical, present in the world in tangible ways. The texts describe the Anunnaki with bureaucratic precision. They name them individually. They record their decisions. They describe their needs, preferences, and behaviours with the same matter-of-fact tone used for human kings and administrators. The Sumerians were practical people. They invented writing for accounting. They developed law codes to regulate actual social problems. They built irrigation systems to solve real agricultural challenges. They didn't seem inclined toward elaborate fantasy or abstract symbolism. When they described the world, they did so with concrete specificity. So when they described the Anunnaki as beings who descended from heaven, who required feeding and housing, who made decisions affecting human affairs, who could kill or show mercy according to their will, perhaps they were describing their understanding of reality rather than creating mythology. Perhaps they believed, as concretely as they believed in the rivers that fed their fields, that the Anunnaki existed and required architectural accommodation. If we take this perspective seriously, the underground chambers make different sense, not as hiding from space aliens, but as practical response to powerful beings whose relationship with humanity was complex and sometimes threatening. The Sumerians built toward heaven because the Anunnaki descended from above. They built into the earth because sometimes, when the gods grew angry or decided human population needed reduction, the only survival strategy was withdrawal from sight. This interpretation doesn't require believing in the literal truth of Sumerian religion. We don't have to accept that the Anunnaki actually existed, but we might benefit from understanding that the Sumerians believed they existed, and that this belief shaped their architecture, their society, their entire civilization in ways we're only beginning to understand. The question isn't whether ancient astronauts visited Earth. The question is whether we can understand ancient people's beliefs on their own terms, taking seriously what they tell us about their world even when it doesn't fit our comfortable categories of mythology and symbolism. The Sumerians built elaborate underground chambers beneath their temples. They maintained them for thousands of years at enormous expense, and they did this because of beliefs about beings called Anunnaki. Whether those beliefs reflected actual beings, cultural memory of traumatic events, or something else entirely, they were real enough to shape the physical world the Sumerians created. In the 1920s, Leonard Woolley made a discovery at Ur that sent shockwaves through archaeology. A layer of clean, water-deposited clay 11 feet thick separating earlier occupation layers from later ones. He believed he had found evidence of the biblical flood. Later excavations at other Mesopotamian sites found similar flood deposits, though they didn't all date to the same period, suggesting multiple severe floods rather than one universal deluge. But what interested later archaeologists was the evidence that Sumerian cities rebuilt after these floods with different architecture, specifically with more elaborate underground construction in their temple complexes. As if the floods had taught them something about the need for refuge beneath the earth. Protection not from water, but from whatever the water might signify. Woolley's discovery came during his excavation of the royal cemetery at Ur. Digging beneath the cemetery levels, his workers encountered a layer of clean clay with no artifacts, no pottery, no evidence of human occupation. Just pure water-deposited sediment stretching 11 feet thick across the excavation area. Below this clay layer, they found earlier occupation levels showing a different material culture, suggesting the flood had created a sharp break between two distinct periods of settlement. Woolley was convinced he had found the flood, the biblical deluge, Noah's catastrophe preserved in the geological record. He announced his discovery with dramatic flair, capturing international attention. The press reported it as confirmation of biblical narrative. Religious communities celebrated it as archaeological proof of Scripture's historical accuracy. But subsequent excavations complicated Woolley's interpretation. Max Mallowan, excavating Nineveh in the 1930s, found a flood deposit there, but it dated to a different period than Ur's. Excavations at Kish found multiple flood layers at different dates. Shuruppak showed evidence of severe flooding, but at yet another date. The pattern suggested that Mesopotamia, a region built on floodplains between two unpredictable rivers, experienced multiple catastrophic floods throughout its early history, not a single universal deluge. The Tigris and Euphrates flood irregularly and violently. Unlike the Nile's predictable annual flooding, Mesopotamian rivers can remain normal for years, then suddenly surge with devastating force, breaking levees, drowning fields, destroying cities. For populations living on flat terrain with few natural refuges, such floods would be genuinely catastrophic, erasing entire settlements and forcing survivors to rebuild from ruins. But here's what archaeologists noticed when comparing pre-flood and post-flood architecture. The elaborate underground chamber systems beneath temple complexes appear primarily in post-flood construction. The earliest temples at Eridu, predating known flood deposits, had some underground elements but not the extensive, sophisticated chamber networks found in later periods. After the floods, temple construction showed increased emphasis on underground architecture, as if the experience of catastrophic inundation had taught the Sumerians something about the need for depth. Why would flooding encourage underground construction? The logic seems backwards. If floods are the threat, you build higher, not deeper. You create elevated platforms above flood levels. You develop drainage systems to channel water away. You don't dig elaborate chambers that would flood first in any inundation, unless the flood taught them something else, unless the catastrophe wasn't primarily about rising water, but about what the water represented or what accompanied it. The Sumerian flood narratives describe divine decision to destroy humanity. The water was the mechanism, but the threat was from above, from the gods who decided human noise and numbers had become unbearable. If this was how Sumerians understood the flood, if they saw it not as natural disaster but as divine action, then their architectural response makes different sense. Build higher to meet the gods when they descend. Build deeper to hide when they turn hostile. Create architecture that acknowledges both the need to accommodate divine presence and the possibility of needing refuge from divine anger. The flood deposits themselves are indisputable. Multiple catastrophic floods struck Mesopotamian cities between 4000 and 3000 BCE. Entire settlement levels were buried under water-deposited sediment. Populations were displaced or destroyed. Cities had to rebuild from foundations or relocate entirely. What remains debatable is how these physical catastrophes shaped Sumerian beliefs and architecture. Did experiencing devastating floods lead them to create flood mythology featuring angry gods? Or did existing beliefs about divine threats make them interpret natural floods as divine action, reinforcing architectural practices meant to provide refuge from heavenly anger? The correlation between flood deposits and elaborate underground construction suggests some connection. Whether that connection was practical response to natural disaster or religious response to what they believed the disaster meant, or combination of both, the Sumerians who rebuilt after the floods created different architecture than their ancestors who built before. They went deeper, built more extensively below ground, created elaborate chamber systems that required enormous effort to construct and maintain. The memory of these floods persisted for thousands of years. The Sumerian king list divides history into antediluvian and post-diluvian periods. The flood becomes the great dividing point, the catastrophe that ended the old world and required building a new one. And in that new world, in the cities that rose from the mud the floods left behind, the Sumerians built downward as well as upward, creating spaces beneath the earth that their ancestors apparently hadn't needed or hadn't thought to create. By 1500 BCE, Sumerian language was dead, preserved only by scribes who studied it like we study Latin. The great cities had declined or been absorbed into Babylonian and Assyrian empires. But the knowledge systems the Sumerians had developed, their astronomy, mathematics, and legal codes persisted and influenced every culture that followed. Yet the elaborate underground construction beneath temple complexes stopped. New temples built by Babylonians and Assyrians had subterranean elements, but nothing matching the scale or complexity of the earlier Sumerian structures. Either the need had passed, or the memory of why such spaces mattered had faded into myth. The Anunnaki remained in Mesopotamian religion, but increasingly as distant abstract deities rather than immediate physical presences requiring earthly architecture to accommodate. The death of Sumerian language was gradual but inexorable. Akkadian, a Semitic language, had coexisted with Sumerian for centuries, eventually becoming dominant in daily speech while Sumerian remained the language of scholarship and religion. By 1500 BCE, no one spoke Sumerian as their native language. It survived only in scribal schools, where students learned to read ancient texts and compose traditional literary works in a language no longer living. This linguistic shift paralleled cultural transformation. The independent Sumerian city-states were absorbed into larger political entities, first the Akkadian Empire, then the Uruk dynasty, then Old Babylonian kingdoms, and finally the great Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires. Political centralization changed how people organized their lives, practiced religion, and understood their relationship with the divine. But remarkably, much of Sumerian knowledge survived this cultural transformation. The base 60 number system continued in use. The astronomical observations and mathematical tables were copied and expanded by Babylonian scribes. The legal principles established in the code of Ur-Nammu influenced Hammurabi's famous law code. The myths and epics were translated into Akkadian and Babylonian, preserving stories even as the language that first told them faded. Yet something essential was lost. The temple architecture of later Mesopotamian civilizations differed fundamentally from Sumerian practice. Babylonian and Assyrian temples were grand, elaborate, richly decorated, but their underground elements were simpler, more clearly oriented toward foundation work and storage, rather than the extensive chamber networks the Sumerians had built. The ziggurat tradition continued. Babylon's Anunnaki, the Tower of Babel from biblical tradition, was a massive ziggurat dedicated to Marduk, but evidence suggests its underground construction was less elaborate than earlier Sumerian examples. The upward-reaching impulse remained. The downward burrowing impulse diminished. Why? Perhaps because the relationship with the divine had changed. The Anunnaki persisted in Mesopotamian religion, but their character evolved. Babylonian theology emphasized Marduk, who had defeated primordial chaos and established order. Assyrian religion centered on Ashur, a warrior deity who ensured imperial conquest. The intimate, immediate, sometimes terrifying presence of the Sumerian Anunnaki became more abstract, more distant, more compatible with how we typically think of ancient gods. The texts reflect this change. Early Sumerian hymns describe gods requiring daily feeding, specific care, physical accommodation. Later Babylonian texts treat divine offerings more symbolically, less as literal feeding of physical beings and more as ritual acknowledgement of divine power. The transactional relationship between gods and humans that characterized Sumerian religion softened into more conventional worship. As the gods became more abstract, the architecture that accommodated them became less elaborate. If divine beings no longer descended to dwell in temples, if their presence became spiritual rather than physical, if their relationship with humanity transformed from immediate interaction to distant sovereignty, then the need for elaborate underground refuges would diminish. The chambers might remain from earlier construction, but new temples wouldn't replicate them because the threat they addressed no longer seemed immediate. Or perhaps the knowledge simply faded. Cultural memory is fragile. When the scribes who maintained the old practices died without passing on full understanding to their students, when political upheaval disrupted religious continuity, when new peoples with different beliefs absorbed the old territories, the reasons for building underground chambers might have been forgotten even if vague sense of their religious importance persisted. By the time Herodotus visited Babylon in the 5th century BCE, 900 years after Sumerian language died, he described magnificent temples and strange religious practices, but showed no awareness of extensive underground construction. Either such spaces no longer existed in the temples he saw, or they were no longer accessible or acknowledged by the priests who showed him around. The knowledge system survived because they were useful. Mathematics works regardless of language or culture. Astronomical observations remain valid across civilizations. Legal principles can be adapted to new contexts. But architectural practices tied to specific religious beliefs about the physical nature of divine beings, those could be lost when the beliefs changed, or the beings they accommodated withdrew or were reinterpreted as abstract rather than physical. What remains are the sealed chambers beneath tells throughout Uruk, evidence of practices that sustained Sumerian civilization for thousands of years, then ended when the culture that created them transformed into something else. After more than a century of excavation and translation, after thousands of tablets read and ruins explored. One question persists. Why did the Sumerians, the first civilization to write, to build cities, to organize complex society, why did they invest such extraordinary effort in constructing elaborate spaces beneath the earth? The official answers, storage and ritual, don't account for the scale. The controversial answers, underground cities for refuge, lack definitive proof. But perhaps the question itself matters more than the answer. Perhaps what we should ask isn't whether the Sumerians built underground cities to hide from the Anunnaki, but why we're so quick to dismiss the possibility that ancient people took their own beliefs seriously enough to build architecture around them. They believed in the Anunnaki. They believed these beings walked among them, and they built accordingly, reaching toward heaven and burrowing into earth, creating a civilization that acknowledged forces beyond human control. More than a century of archaeology in Mesopotamia has produced extraordinary discoveries. We've recovered hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets. We've excavated dozens of cities. We've mapped settlement patterns across thousands of years. We've pieced together political histories, economic systems, and religious practices with remarkable detail. We understand Sumerian civilization better than any other ancient culture except perhaps Egypt and classical Greece. Yet this fundamental question about their architecture remains unanswered. Not because archaeologists haven't looked, but because the evidence resists simple interpretation. The chambers are there. The effort is documented. But the purpose remains obscure, hidden behind cultural frameworks we can study but struggle to truly understand. Modern archaeology tends toward materialist explanations. Underground chambers must serve practical functions: storage, foundation work, ritual spaces for priestly activities. These explanations are comfortable because they require no leap of understanding, no attempt to see the world as the Sumerians saw it. We can catalogue the chambers, measure them, document their construction techniques, and file them away as interesting architectural features of unclear purpose. But what if we tried something different? What if we took the Sumerians at their word? Not literally, but seriously. They said the Anunnaki descended from heaven. They described these beings requiring accommodation, feeding, service. They recorded divine decisions that threatened human existence. They wrote about floods sent deliberately to reduce human population. They documented fear alongside worship, service alongside devotion, and they built accordingly. They created ziggurats that reached toward heaven, providing landing platforms and dwelling places for beings who came from above. They constructed elaborate underground chambers, spaces deep beneath the earth where humans could withdraw when divine presence became threatening rather than sustaining. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't irrational fear. This was practical architecture designed to accommodate practical beliefs about how the world actually worked. If powerful beings descended from heaven, you built structures to receive them. If those beings sometimes turned hostile, you built refuges to survive their anger. Simple. Logical architecture for people who understood the cosmos as populated by powerful forces that required both reverence and caution. We don't have to believe the Anunnaki literally existed to understand that the Sumerians believed they existed and built accordingly. We don't have to accept ancient cosmology to recognize that ancient architecture expressed ancient beliefs in concrete, physical form. The Sumerians created the first civilization. They invented writing, mathematics, law, and urban planning, and they built elaborate underground chambers beneath their temples because their understanding of reality, their beliefs about the nature of divine beings, made such construction necessary. Perhaps the question we should be asking isn't what the chambers were for, but why we're so resistant to understanding architecture as expression of genuine belief. Modern people build churches that reach toward heaven, not because we literally expect divine beings to land on steeples, but because our understanding of transcendence expresses itself upward. The Sumerians built downward as well as upward, because their understanding of divine presence included the possibility of threat, the need for refuge, the practical requirement of having places to hide when heaven's attention became dangerous. The chambers remained sealed beneath 4,000 years of accumulated debris and subsequent construction. Most will never be fully excavated. The modern cities built on top of ancient tells make comprehensive archaeology impossible, but the pattern is clear enough. The Sumerians who invented civilization, who developed writing and mathematics and law, who watched the heavens with precision and built irrigation systems of stunning sophistication. These same people invested extraordinary resources in underground architecture beneath their most sacred spaces. They did this for reasons that made sense within their worldview, their cosmology, their understanding of how gods and humans interacted. That we struggle to recover those reasons says less about the Sumerians than about how thoroughly our own worldview differs from theirs. We've forgotten how to think like people who believed the sky held dangers as well as wonders, who understood divine beings as present and physical rather than distant and abstract, who built architecture acknowledging threats from heaven as well as earth. The question remains, the chambers remain, and beneath the Iraqi desert, sealed passages still descend into darkness, holding silences that preserve questions we've only begun to ask. And so, as you drift towards sleep tonight, somewhere between dream and history, consider those ancient scribes in the lamplight at Eridu, pressing warnings into wet clay with reed stylus, recording beliefs we struggle to understand across 5,000 years of silence. They believed in beings who descended from heaven. They built ziggurats to receive them and chambers to hide from them. They organized their entire civilization around forces we can barely imagine, creating architecture that acknowledged both worship and fear, both reaching upward and burrowing down. The chambers rest beneath the Iraqi desert now, most still sealed, filled with the rubble their builders carefully placed when they finally departed. The tablets sit in museum cases behind protective glass, their cuneiform marks still holding questions about the Anunnaki, about floods sent deliberately, about knowledge that appeared too suddenly to be entirely human discovery. Whether those questions have answers, or whether the answers would satisfy us if we found them, perhaps matters less than the simple fact that the Sumerians built with purpose, believed with intensity, and created spaces beneath the earth for reasons that seemed essential to their survival. You're connected to them across time, part of the same human story of watching the sky, wondering about forces beyond our control, building shelters against threats we may not fully understand. They looked up at the same stars you see tonight, tracked the same planets across the darkness, and wondered what descended from that vastness above. Their fear and reverence shaped the first cities, the first writing, the first civilization, and deep beneath those first cities, the chambers wait in sealed darkness, holding silence that might be answer or might simply be the patient quiet of stones that have forgotten their purpose. So let yourself drift now, into the same darkness those ancient astronomers watched, under the same sky they tracked with such careful attention. Rest easy. The ancient world has kept its secrets for 5,000 years. It will wait while you sleep, holding its mysteries in clay and stone and sealed passages beneath the earth, ready to whisper its questions again when you wake. Rest now. Let the weight of all that history, all those buried chambers, all that forgotten knowledge settle around you like a blanket. Sleep well.